This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by Atom Audio, Isotope, Native Instruments, Lewitt, and Grace Design. You're hearing my voice right now on the new Lewitt Ray microphone with Aura, Auto Gain, and EQ mode through the Grace Design M201 Mark II mic pre, mixed through Isotope, Voice Enhancement Assistant RX, Ozone, Neutron, and Nectar on Atom Audio monitors. Please check out our awesome sponsors using the links in the show notes. It's a great way to help support this show. Now get ready to rock.
The person coming into the studio is responding to all the studio tech and the way you're doing stuff in the studio in the same way that your grandmother is responding to Instagram. If you assume that, then you'll do enough to put them at their ease. Just doing a running commentary of what it is you're doing. You stick someone in front of a large diaphragm condenser mic. Most people don't really come into contact with those at all, and they know nothing about it other than this is some black magic studio gear.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. No matter what style of music you make, Native Instruments gives your studio all the instruments you need. From drums, loops, and beats to the coolest synthesizers, realistic strings, guitar amps, and futuristic synth pads. I love to record real bands in my studio, but then I mix it up with cool sounds from Contact, Massive X, Super 8, Battery, Guitar Rig, and Hybrid keys, for example, to make my music way more exciting and interesting. Use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off, or download the free gifts waiting for you, like the awesome new Jacob Collier Audience Choir or Complete Start, featuring 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of free samples at nativeinstruments.com. Are you recording your own music or other people's music in your studio, but you're having trouble figuring out how to get your mixes to sound great? Do they sound kind of weak or distant or lack punch and clarity? Well, I've got a gift to help you take your mixes from sounding like basement demos to sounding much closer to professional mixes. And it's my free course called Mix Master Bundle. This course will show you how to get pro-sounding mixes from your home studio with free and stock plugins in Pro Tools. And the best part is that these mixing techniques work for you in any DAW, whether you're on Logic, Cubase, Studio One, Reaper, anything you can think of. If you're ready now to make your best record ever, then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now, and you can find the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Howdy, Rockstars. It's your host, Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Mike Senior, a professional recording mixing engineer, teacher, and writer for years at Sound on Sound magazine. He is also the author of the popular books Mixing Secrets for the Small Studio and its sequel, Recording Secrets for the Small Studio, which has recently come out with the updated second edition. Mike has also been on the podcast for episodes RSR455 and RSR455, which you can hear in the attached playlist. So please go check those out because we talked about a lot of great stuff, including how he got into music and some great tips for your studio. Today, we're going to focus on the new version of his popular book and see what tips and insights we can learn from making great recordings in your home studio. Especially if you're starting out in recording, you will love the content covered in this book. But even if you've been recording for a while, it can be fun to discover new techniques and rethink ways of recording. And so it's always a pleasure to have Mike joining us here on the podcast. So please welcome back Mike Senior to Recording Studio Rockstars. Mike, are you ready to rock, my man?
I'm 100% ready to rock.
Oh, hell yeah, dude. So tell us where you're joining us from. I remember last time we were chatting, it's like, you know, you're British, but you live in Germany. You're like all over the place, man. So where are you today?
I am speaking to you from snowy Munich, in fact. The temperature's gone down. This is where I've been now for almost 15 years. Although there's a possibility in the next couple of years that I may be moving back to the UK. It's all a bit up in the air because it depends a little bit on what my daughters are doing. So
Right on. Yeah, congrats on that, man. My daughter's the best record I ever made, so I understand that. Yeah, Munich, I got to visit there a little bit and go see King Ludwig II's castle up on the hill and go to the Opera House, where I may or may not have tried to walk out with my pint glass.
I think they're specially trained to catch people.
Yeah, I figured I don't think I got very far.
Wrestled to the ground by the tuba player.
Yeah, and then they convinced me to buy another round for everybody. I don't know how they pulled that off, but it worked. So tell us a little bit about your world right now. So you've got your, are you joining us from your home studio? Do you have a home studio setup that is particularly useful to you these days?
Yes, I mean I'm speaking from my mix room, such as it is. The anyone who's read any of my books, all the stuff that's in there comes from my life. You know, I live a Project Studio existence, so I have a mix room at home. That's where I'm speaking to you from now. And then I do most of my recording on location. I have all my stuff packed into boxes, and then whenever I'm going to record a band or record someone, I'll go out to their house, rehearsal studio, school, wherever it is, build a studio on site with all my own gear, record them there, and then bring the tracks back here to mix. And of course, I do all my mixing work and stuff here in a general sense.
So talk a little bit about that too, because I'm always intrigued by the portable studio. I mean, I've done my own versions of it, and I've seen other people have really impressive, kits, I think, as you would say, over there. And versus like my own versions where I'm just like throwing everything into a box or a bag or trying to keep track of the stuff. Have you learned anything about having sort of a dialed in portable studio where you can just sort of grab it and go and you've got what you need and can keep track of things?
A little bit. Usually the location sessions I do are large scale enough that it's not an impromptu thing. I have to do a good deal of planning. And usually when I do a location recording session, it's something I've never done before in a place I've never been. With musicians maybe that I'm working with for the first time, I do a lot of different things in different styles with different people. So there's not much kind of, you don't do much repeat stuff. You have to rethink it from scratch every time. So, I mean, probably the biggest hack from my perspective is just that the way I approach recording is very much from the perspective of the instruments and the room and the mics, and everything else I keep as simple as I possibly can. Basically, I try and get the sound completely out of the mics if I can.
So that's intriguing to me. So you've got the home mix studio setup where it's like a benchmark setup. It's like, you know what to expect of the sound coming out of your speakers, but then you venture out into the unpredictable world of spaces everywhere to set up microphones and record everything. I think that's a really exciting way to make records because, there's a lot more variety in what you can do in some ways. And then, you get to come back and hear these captured locations and spaces coming out of the same speakers in your studio where you must immediately have a take on like, oh, wow, that's what that sounds like. Oh, I love this thing, or I can't stand this thing. Do you have anything, what are your thoughts about working that way as opposed to a studio environment might be a control room and then the live rooms are the same old live rooms every day on every session right out in front of you?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, everyone thinks of me as a mix engineer, and yes, that's probably, I do more of that than anything else, but recording is the most fun. I mean, mixing, you've got to have a certain mindset and you've got to be quite detail orientated. There's a certain amount of performance in it, but there's a lot of just sheer technical stuff that you need to deal with and you need to keep your brain in gear. Recording is such a rush, particularly the way I like generally to record, which is as quickly as possible and get as many people in the room as possible. It's actual connection with real music making happening then and there. I mean, there is nothing better than having set up a band, hit record, and because of the way you set it up, a record comes at you live out of the speakers in whatever cupboard you've set up your speakers in. I mean, some of the highlights of my recording existence have been situations where I have heard a finished record coming back at me when I've hit record. And it's just, there's almost nothing to beat that thing because it's so immediate, it's so quick, and it's in connection with the real music. I mean, you're a musician yourself. The reason why we all got into this is because we like musicians, we like music, we want music to happen, we want to be part of music making. And yeah, that's... Do I sound enthusiastic enough?
I think so, yeah. That's one of the things I love about you, man. You exude enthusiasm. In fact, even reading your book, I think you called it the Angloisms or something. There's all these funny expressions in here that I think are just like commonplace for you. But as an American living in Nashville, I read these expressions like, what? I'm like, what does duffing mean? And stuff like that. There's all these really funny little expressions. So your enthusiasm, it translates.
Funnily enough,
for sure.
I had to look something up in the book the other day, and I came across the sentence something like, "So we toddle over to have a gander." I thought, I'm amazed the editor let that one through. I don't think anyone outside the UK, even certain parts of the UK, will understand what on earth I mean by that.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, what in the world does that even mean? Well, what does that mean? I think that means
to toddle over is to kind of stroll over, to amble over, and to have a gander is...
To look at it.
It's interesting. I think, it's to look at it. I think it's Cockney rhyming slang, but I'm not sure what it's for.
Well, but I mean, I think, have a gander at something. I think you hear that over here sometimes too. Old school English too, American English. All right. Well, so yeah, I mean, I think about the times where I had my first studio gear and I'd set up and everything's an adventure because you don't even have a dedicated studio. You're just setting up in a living room, setting up in a bedroom, taking it wherever. And also with that, my control room was usually getting set up in the same space, a pair of speakers or headphones. So that was changing too. And so that can be fun, but it's like I'm constantly moving the goalpost, so it'd be hard in those situations to get a real handle on, well, what sounds right, and one of the things we did when we were doing field recording is we always had the car, and the car became our control room where you could bring a cassette back and listen again later and decide like, okay, now I know what this sounds and how it sounds different from this other thing. But it's cool, again, just referring back to your setup where if you've got a consistent mix environment, then you can bring these recordings back and listen and really get a sense of like, wow, this small space in a house sounds very different from this big space in a in a theater or a church or something like that. What are some of the most exciting spaces you've recorded with your remote?
Exciting spaces. I mean, I've recorded in churches. In a sense, I think the most exciting spaces for me are spaces that weren't meant for that purpose and where you just have to kind of jury rig some kind of a recording setup out of an existing set of rooms or a house or a flat or something. There was, I recorded in some guy's loft conversion where to get into the light control room space, I had to constantly duck under a beam that was going across the ceiling space. I had to hang something on it to make sure I didn't brain myself on it by going back and forth in between takes. Or I recorded, in fact, one of my favorite records that I've ever done. I recorded in a kind of converted Bavarian pub. A guy it had been a pub, and then a guy was repurposing it as a kind of a homebrew TV studio, and we just kind of used it while he was renovating it. And yeah,
they kept the beer taps though, right?
I don't think he did. No, I think all that stuff had been removed. It was far too valuable to the previous owners.
Homebrew's figuratively speaking.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool. I mean, I've definitely been in some weird spaces. There was a studio with the band The Living Things, and we were in Williamsburg, New York, and they had an apartment, and there was like a hidden basement room, a secret basement room in this apartment. You had to crawl down through a hole, and then it was kind of like, what was it, like floor 3.5 or something in the Being John Malkovich, where it was like it was a halfway story on an elevator. So it felt like that. And I could go in and work in there, but you couldn't stand up. The ceiling was
wow. Then that reminds me of one I did, actually. I was recording in some guy's home studio where the live room where we were trying to record rock drums was so low that I couldn't stand up straight.
From the drums, you couldn't get
But I couldn't actually stand up straight in the room because the ceiling was so low. And
you crawled into the drum kit? You would crawl through the kick drum or something?
It was almost, to get through from the live room to their kind of control room, you had to crawl through this little tunnel that was only about 4 feet high. So it was, yeah. Oh, I don't know. But I love that kind of stuff.
It's fun.
Or where I was doing a session with a band where we were using a kind of it must have been some kind of a school or theatre complex or something, I don't know. But there was a main little auditorium where we set up the main band. I was backstage as a kind of control room. There was a room they had to store chairs and stuff that we used as an ISO booth. And then up the stairs on the floor above, we had 4 vocalists all singing together in like an ISO booth thing. And you've got like snakes all over the place and cables going left, right, and center. But I love that kind of stuff. It's
do
great.
you still use long analog cabling to get mics all the way down to your control room, or have you ever dabbled into Ethernet, where like maybe you're controlling the mic?
I've had some recommendations for that kind of stuff, and now that you can send kind of analog audio down Cat5 and have those boxes at all ends. I've considered it. The main reason I don't do it is just that, over the years I've built up a stock of traditional stuff. Yeah. And so, and it all works and I know it. And so,
and it sounds great, right?
I don't really feel the need to complicate it any further than it already is.
That's true. There is something to be said for accumulating all this collection of gear that makes up our studio and then just saying, this is it. This is what I got. I'm going to stick to it for a while. And that kind of pivots to the topic of your book. So once you've decided these are some of the tools I'm going to use, then a big part of recording is, okay, now how do I just record? How do I capture sounds and spaces in these home studio environments and these odd, unusual spaces? So tell us a little bit about your new book, Recording Secrets for the Home Studio. It's a book that's been around for a while, but I think this is the second edition. Is that right?
Yes, it's the second edition of it. There were various things that I wanted to do to kind of improve and update it based on, obviously you get feedback from readers who are not bashful in telling you what they think about it in various different ways. I just wanted to update it as well. It had been a while since I'd written it, and it incorporates so much stuff that I've done from researching different producers. Obviously, that you get new interviews, new techniques coming out that I want to include. So, I was updating a lot of the producer quotes as well in the book into the bargain. But the book itself, it's kind of come from various different places. Probably the initial kind of impetus of it was just that I've done so much mixing. Particularly through my Sound on Sound Mix Rescue remixes. I've done 60 odd of those, and I'm always seeing Project Studio recordings coming in. Like the multi-track library that I run, I'm always looking at those multi-tracks as well and commenting on those. And so often I see multi-tracks and recordings that just unnecessarily make life difficult for you when you're mixing.
Yeah,
and it's in a sense writing a recording book came from doing a lot of mixing and thinking, I wish they recorded that differently, or how could I make it that I don't get this problem then when I get to the mix down stage.
Right, so you can really hear some of the exaggerated problems when you get these mixes coming in and you get to,
Well, yes. Probably to take a really common example, for example, there's when people record drums, the number of times you'll get it where they've used a kind of a setup that has the overhead mics right over the cymbals, and then they just have a snare close mic on the top of the snare. And it means that the only snare sound really you get in the mix is a combination of a rather dull kind of background snare ambience from the microphones that are pointing at the cymbals, because they're picking up really dull sounding snare ambience, and then this kind of doink that you get from the snare drum mic over the top of the snare. And I've lost count of how many multi-tracks I've had to try and mix that have that issue, and it's just so unnecessary.
Right.
If you only have, go on. Yeah.
Well, so I was going to say, and apologies, I don't mean to interrupt. In fact, you talk about unbashful comments from your audience. And I was thinking of like, what are the worst comments I get? And it was like, stop interrupting, dude. So Rockstars, that is one of the natures of doing Zoom call interviews, is sometimes it's just hard to have that back and forth. But you're talking about like, so overhead mics, close mics, we're in a small space for drums. And because there's no real ambient mics or room mics out there, it doesn't have that natural quality to the drums. And you have to create that somehow.
Well, it's just the question of asking yourself when you're recording something, is having a vision for what you want the end result to sound like, and making sure that appears somewhere on the mics that you've set up, on the signals that you've got. And in the situation where you've got overheads over your cymbals, and you've got a snare mic pointed right at the top of the snare, where is the snare sound? It's not there on any of the mics. If you want a snare that sounds big and powerful and goes boosh, you've got to have a mic signal that does that somewhere to make that sound possible. Yeah,
in other words, I forgot the term. Get it right at the source. GRATs, as
all right.
Joe Gilder likes to call it. But that idea of like getting a sound right at the source. And also, because I think sometimes we think, well, I don't know how to do that. I thought that was something that happens in the mix, is learning to just say what I think you're suggesting, which is if you want your drums to sound a certain way, hopefully get that sound in one of the mics somehow, or at least experiment with the mics until that sound begins to present itself in one of those microphones. And then you might be like, okay, now I'm in the ballpark with the sound.
Yes. I mean, 100%. I mean, just a big part of the battle with recording is simply acknowledging that when you're recording something, you want to try and get a sound, you want to try and have a sound in mind that you want. And if the mics aren't giving you that sound, that you try and just do something to try and make whatever you're picking up through the mics sound more like what you hear in your head.
Yeah.
And it seems almost like illuminating the blindingly obvious to say that, but the number of recordings I get where someone will put 3 mics on an acoustic guitar would clearly not have thought about what any of those mics need to sound like or why they're sounding that way. And 2 of them, I don't know, 2 of them sound the same. So it's like, there's no point in having those 2 microphones there at all. And both of the 2 different sounds that they've got sound equally horrible in different ways. It's like, well, no, give me one mic that sounds okay, rather than just assuming that if you put up enough mics, something will catch the instrument.
And I mean, I think a good place to start. So then there's part of me that says, oh, well, maybe they're standing in the room and they're feeling excited about the music. So therefore they're hoping that these mics are capturing what they're hearing. And then that begs the question, well, if you're standing somewhere and you're excited about what you're hearing, did you put a mic where your ears were? Because that might be a good place to experiment with the mic position, right?
It can be. It's a bit of a two-edged sword, though, that. Because your ears, I mean, my experience, your ears are kind of not quite as directional as a cardioid microphone.
Yeah.
And a bit more directional than an Omni. So if you put a cardioid microphone where your head is, you're actually going to pick up a little bit less than what you're hearing. And so if you put a cardioid microphone where your head is, you tend to catch a little bit less of the instrument than you really wanted. So it's tough judging
like
by where your head is.
Well, and there's also, I think there's more to it. I think because our ears are way more complex than a microphone diaphragm, we have to take into account that our brain is playing into a part of the function of what we hear with our ears too. So in other words,
indeed,
our pair of ears in a space are picking up the sound of the drums in front of us. They're also picking up the sound of the drums bouncing off the walls, off the ceilings, off the floor. And because it's 2 ears and our brain knows how to interpret the shape of our ears and translate that into sound, our brain...
And crucially, we're hearing what we're seeing.
Right. Exactly. So our brain is filtering out all this other noise that a microphone can't filter out. It's just going to give us everything that is there, whether we want it or not.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing. So, and then the other part too is, let's go a step further from that. Maybe if you pause and you think about what you're hearing with your ears in the room, you realize you're not hearing anything even close to what your vision is to begin with. In which
Yes.
case, I think then that's a point at which it makes a lot of sense, right? To work harder on making sure the instrument's even putting out the sound that is your vision.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, I look at it as a kind of an inverse pyramid or something like that. I don't know whether that's quite the right analogy. But that if you're looking to try and make a difference to the sound, just change it in some way. And, if it's not what you want, then you want to change it in some way. The way in which you're going to change it the most and the quickest is by dealing with the player or the instrument or the acoustics, those kinds of bits that are nothing to do with the microphone. Then you can adjust it by where you put the microphone and what kind of microphone you choose. And it's only after that then you've got the preamp and the recording system and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So, and it's almost like it's a factor of 2 or 3 difference. Changing the snare drum is going to make 3 times as much difference as changing the microphone will.
Right. Well, you make a good point. You make a good point that in this world of home recording, we don't need to buy any gear at all to begin our journey. We could actually start with just the instrument and playing it in a space until we start thinking that, hey, this is worth recording. Now we can worry about
100%.
What should I get next?
100%. 100%. In fact, this feeds into something that's recently, over the last year, I've been teaching myself bass guitar. And one of the reasons, it's difficult to explain the reasons, but in doing that, I didn't do that kind of to become a bass guitarist. I did it just kind of to accompany people and
just to be
for
cool.
a specific purpose.
You just wanted to be cool.
Of course. But in the process of doing that, I thought, well, I might as well be able to use this to do overdubs and do bass parts on things if I need to for my production work. And so when I got the bass guitar, I thought, okay, what's going to give me the kind of bass sound that I like? So I did a bit of research, spoke to some bass players who've played bass lines that I like the sound of, and got that guitar and got those strings and played it in that way to the point where and the difference that it makes at each stage of the process before any type of processing is involved meant that then, even 3 months after I started playing bass guitar, my bass part appeared on one of the records I mixed for the client. And they were like, yeah, great. Do you want to do it on this other track I've done? So it's like 0 to session bass player in about 3 months.
Nice.
But without having to do anything to the sound. I pretty much just mixed it in because at every step on the way I thought, well, what's going to be the most useful bass sound for me to use? And it's nothing fancy. I do one bass sound. That's it. But it's the useful bass sound that I wanted.
Yeah.
And it's that approach that I think it's not rocket science to go, okay, I'm recording acoustic guitar. Maybe I should first think about what strings I've got on this thing. Obviously whether it's in tune, what pick I'm using, how I'm striking the string, how hard I'm playing it or not. What environment I'm sitting in. And each of these little steps suddenly makes a whole bunch of other things with the mics and all that kind of stuff so much easier.
Yeah. In 2024, Adam Audio celebrates 25 years of designing industry-leading monitors in Berlin, unveiling the Arctic White A4V and A7V series, available for a limited time. With the XART ribbon tweeter design, customizable speaker voicings, and SonarWorks integration for room correction, these monitors deliver professional-grade sound perfect for Grammy-winning producers and home studios. Make your studio cooler than cool with the Arctic White series and get the Adam Audio A4V and A7V with an extended 5-year warranty at adamaudio.com. Yeah, and it's funny that you bring up bass because that is one of those instruments that I've really noticed translates as an engineer, as a mix engineer. It's literally the instrument other than synthesizers that we can play from the control room and hear it out of the same speakers that we're mixing on so that we can determine whether it's in the ballpark of where our vision is going for this thing.
Yes.
I'm always amazed, you can record a bass with headphones out next to the band, but if you just come in and overdub the bass with the speakers hearing the drums really clearly, it's just a totally different experience a lot of times. You get a really different result. Not always better, but a lot of times it can be an improvement on something that was just a pretty good idea to begin with or something. It's context sensitive. But it also, like you say, the low end of a mix is one of the challenging zones to get everything to really feel like a great mix, And so
it's the tough bit for recording too,
right,
particularly in a Project Studio.
Yeah,
really tough.
And so like cutting the bass with all that, where you're hearing it out of those mix speakers, really makes a big difference. So therefore, would you recommend to the rock stars that the smart way to cut bass in your home studio is don't plug it into a bass amp and stick a mic in front of it as your go-to, but maybe to do a DI bass and just hear it coming right through your speakers with the music?
Yes. I mean, in a sense, certainly now that amp modeling has got so good, if you do want an amp sound and you're not particularly precious about exactly what the amp sound is, then yeah, I would always, that's certainly the least hassle way of doing it is to DI it. And then also if you listen to the DI, you get a slightly better impression of exactly how you're playing it, how your touch is, whether you're being consistent. The real problem with bass is consistency. And that's one of the things now as a bass player, I find myself thinking about if I'm tracking a bass line is like, not just am I playing the right notes and the right expression, but am I playing consistently? Am I actually digging into each note the right way so that, you don't suddenly have a couple of bass notes that have no low end and some of them have too much low end. Thinking about trying to make it so that it's clean and consistent. And most other things will sort themselves out. The biggest problems in Project Studios are trying to record bass amps or bass instruments, particularly in typical domestic room sizes. The real big problem is that you often get resonances around the 60 or 70 hertz zone. I mean, with an upright bass, that's the air resonance of the instrument anyway. But also the floor-ceiling resonance in most, 2.4 meter, kind of 7-8 foot ceilings is around that zone as well. So the frequency response can get really, really lumpy in that area. And just finding a place where a microphone isn't going to massively overemphasize certain notes of the bass line relative to others can be a challenge. Certainly the real acid test for me if I'm recording like an upright bass or a bass amp is just to get the bass player to play a chromatic scale over the bottom octave and just go, are there any notes taking off here? Are there any notes disappearing?
Where would you begin with that question? Would you begin in the room with the bass and first decide out there, or would you listen on the mic and decide?
I mean, apart from anything, you've got multiple interacting factors. The first thing you've got is that the amp, if it's an amp, the amp itself may be resonating and may have certain notes that are hot and cold, and that may just be a characteristic of the amp. And so you're like, okay, well, maybe I need to take a DI then, use that amp just for monitoring, and then reamp it or use an amp model. Or if it's not the amp, then okay, well there may be resonances in the room. If there are resonances in the room, then you've got to listen around the room and find a place where those resonances are going to comparatively even out, or where you're not going to get big hot and cold spots for unimportant notes. I mean, if you have a hot spot on the keynote of the song, that probably won't do you any harm.
Right.
The problem is if you have a hot note on the sharpened fourth of the key, and then whenever he does a little run between the fourth and the fifth, suddenly this dissonant note takes off. And it's just unmusical. It's just thinking about the music of it. If he's going to play a line, you want it to come across in a comparatively musical way. So try and use whatever resonances you have to your advantage if you can, and just have a listen and make sure you're not making a rob for your own back in terms of some notes disappearing and some notes completely taking off.
Now, I've experienced that in studios where, you hear that you're listening to the bass and you're like, man, some of these notes seem to disappear. And then, there's the expression of wolf tones, which is, those are considered louder. I think those are the louder notes on a bass that might stick out. But then you have these dead zones, and sometimes the instrument itself just doesn't resonate at certain notes.
Yes.
But then you run into the question of thinking, well, what if the instrument is right? And what if it's just my listening environment in the control room and I think that we're losing notes, but we're not really? So have you found any good tricks for, is that where, a real-time analyzer, frequency analyzer can come in helpful to let us know that we're
100%
equal energy?
Certainly if I'm working on location, the monitoring is never, ever ideal. And there are lots of different ways in which you try and mitigate. I mean, you need to give yourself credit as a human that our ears actually do a tremendous job of averaging out a lot of like the vagaries of your monitoring environment when you're working on location, particularly if you're on speakers, because you just walk around, adjusting gear and walking in and out and moving microphones about. You hear the speakers from different positions, and your ear begins to factor out some of the individual resonances in the room. But I mean, I always try and take some kind of reference material with me to listen to the speakers while I'm setting up the gear in the control room. That gives me an idea of what the control room's like. I will often have a spectrum analyzer and also a vector scope, one of those stereo meters, working in the control room, so that I can judge things like, you can listen to a stereo pickup and think that it's roughly central, but the vector scope will give you a much better idea of whether it is, irrespective of whether there's some weird room reflection in your monitoring room that's making things appear left heavy or whatever.
Right, and the vector scope gives you it shows you what's going on in your left, right, or center image. Yeah.
But exactly like you say, with bass, I'll have my eye on a spectrum analyzer at the same time as well. So I get an idea of whether I'm actually hearing any non-linearities just because it's my monitoring room and I'm on location, or because that's actually a problem with the recording itself.
Right, and I suppose like using the signal generator in Pro Tools or something could give you could play different tones down low, maybe. You could
do. I mean, I actually have a kind of a staircase sine wave tones test signal as one of my amongst my reference tracks that I do use to just get any obvious ideas of whether my monitoring room is taking off. To be honest, one of the best investments I've ever made in my location recording setup was getting some pretty good speakers, weirdly enough, because and in a sense it stands to reason, because it's the same with mixing. You're only as powerful as how much you can hear.
Yeah.
And that's why you make so much effort to make sure that your listening environment is good when you're mixing. And I found that that's really, really paid off with recording as well. And in fact, the speakers that I have for recording are more powerful than my mixing speakers. I got some secondhand ones, some K&H. Klein and Hummel used to be the company that were bought by Neumann, who now, they that's the technology behind the Neumann speakers. But the previous generation from the mid 90s, they had the kind of version up from the KH310, the 096, I think are the ones I have. And I actually managed to pick up 5 of them because a studio was clearing out its backlot, and they're built like tanks. They're about, I don't know, I think they're about 30 kilos each. They're ridiculously heavy.
But self-powered speakers?
Yeah, but they go quite loud, and they're actually really quite high fidelity. They're closed box speakers as well, which I'm quite a fan of. And they're pretty full range. So they serve that equal purpose of being actually quite a good reference point as a listening experience. And also they go loud enough so that when the band have been thrashing away in the live room and you want them to come in and be impressed by the first take, you can actually turn them up a bit. Which, that has its own benefit too.
Let's go into that part of the question. Let's talk about choosing studio gear and setting up our studios so that we've got some basic tools to work with. And in the one you're describing, you're saying that you have a mix room. So we might talk about that, but you're also saying probably more usefully to begin with for people is this idea of the K&H, portable recording monitors, because I'm going to guess that you're walking into strange spaces and having to figure out how to quickly set up a listening environment that will at least work for you to capture everything, even if you go back to a mix room later.
Yeah. And really, you're at the mercy of whatever place you are. I mean, you might be able to
they
take
could be merciless too. They could be really merciless.
I mean, if you find yourself recording in a church, for example, some of the little side rooms of churches are an absolute nightmare in terms of just stone surfaces everywhere.
Right.
But I mean, you just do what you can. I mean, you take your headphones along, you have your spectrum analyzer, you try and make the best of it you can, monitor in the near field so that you're trying to get less of the input from the room and more from the speakers themselves. But there's always going to be guesswork. I think it's wrong to think that while you're trying to get something that sounds as close to a record as you can while you're recording, it's wrong to think that you're a failure if you miss it. The important thing is that trying to get it will get you close enough that the mix will be able to take you the rest of the distance.
Right. If you can point your boat from England, at least in the right direction of the United States, you're likely to hit somewhere along the coast.
Yeah, that's the idea.
All right. And if it's beautiful, wonderful Maine, as long as it's not winter, you'll be happy when you arrive there. And if you go south, it'll just be warm and sunny and, sand beaches. Yeah. So there you go. Okay. So let's talk about doing that. So when you set up, let's say you are setting up your speakers and the room is like stone side room of a church or something. It kind of also reminds me of what you said when people are sending you a vocal recording or some other instrument, and it's like, I hear so clearly that you've got this problem with the sound, but maybe you didn't hear it. And it reminds me that a lot of home recorded things might be a microphone picking up the sound of the space, and then when they listen back to the recording, they're also listening in that space. So it's all kind of masked, and they may not even realize that they're getting all these reflections into a sound and the sound of a room that they ultimately wish wasn't there.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, there's not much of a fix for it. It's never going to be a well-controlled monitoring environment. In a sense, having speakers that don't complicate the issue in terms of actually reasonably good speakers with you really does make a difference there. I mean, obviously, there's always going to be a budgetary issue. The workaround is if you don't have more expensive speakers, I would advise you to take some speakers, because there's stuff you hear on speakers that you don't really hear that well on headphones, that won't give you a very good kind of sense of balance and stereo width and things.
And energy,
take some headphones
just
as well.
Energy,
yeah.
I find.
And also just for playbacks, it's so much better for communication and the running of a session in a practical sense if there are some speakers there.
Right, okay.
And then take some headphones. I mean, everyone, me included, everyone has to work within the restrictions that they have, and it's never ideal. Project studio work is never ideal, and you kind of do the best you can. You work around it. I mean, like I said, you take your spectrum analyzer, you average the room, you walk around the room a bit, you put up some duvets if it's too reverberant. You use your headphones if you have to. You stay close to the speakers so that you're getting more direct sound and less reverberant sound. But it's always going to be a little bit, it's a bit loosey-goosey, a little bit, I don't know.
Well, so
Anglicism.
When you're setting up speakers somewhere, do you find it useful to try and treat that temporary control room, or do you usually just let it be what it's going to be, set the speakers on a table? And just,
I do.
Is it more useful to listen to the speakers at quieter volumes? You can tell useful things.
I don't know. I mean, the thing about it is that, I worry a lot more about all those things if I were thinking of it as a mixing space. And then, people who know me will know that I worry a lot about those kinds of things. Right. But from a recording perspective, there's a lot about... The thing is, if you think about your listening room and your monitoring room and your speakers on a location situation, if you think of them as a kind of a filter, for want of a better word, kind of like you're putting an EQ on what you're doing. If that EQ is a bit weird, but you're listening to everything through that EQ and you're making all your judgments through that EQ and you're still trying to do the best job based on the information you get, then the relationship between all the things that you're hearing that are coming through those speakers and the decisions you're making, as long as they all make sense in terms of what you're hearing in that environment, when you get to the mix stage and you find that actually I wasn't hearing enough 200 hertz or I was hearing too much 5K, if you correct those things, the relative relationships between all the different things that you heard should still hold up. But there's a caveat there, and the caveat is that you can't just rely on that as a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card. That only works if you put in the legwork to try and get as close as you can by taking some reference material, getting your spectrum analyzer, all these things that are to try and minimize the damage.
Right on.
In fact, to be honest, it's exactly the same if you're doing acoustic treatment for a project studio. My project studio room, none of my project studio mix rooms have or ever will be flat or neutral or whatever you want to call them.
I think I see a sheet hanging up behind you.
Well, it's actually a duvet. This is my special acoustic podcasting duvet that I hang up behind me to try and dry out the sound.
And Rockstars, for those of you in the U.S., a duvet is like a comforter, a big thick blanket, right? A quilt.
Yeah. But
I guess
honestly,
we call it a duvet.
Those are the bits of recording gear I probably use more than any other. I have like 3 or 4 of them, and they all have, those key rings that you can get. That
Right,
like
to
little spirals
hang them
of wire.
on, to put them on a curtain rod.
Yeah, and so I have those on the corners and around the edges of these duvets so that I can hang them up with bungee cords and carabiners and things all over the place. Yeah, I use them for practically every session I do.
They're really, really handy. And I remember doing a lot of sessions early that way where, all my first recordings were in home studio spaces, and it was always a different setup wherever we went. Yeah. And I like to refer to it as guerrilla recording too,
100%. 100%.
Trying to make a studio out of nothing.
But I mean, that's what's so fun about it. And in a sense, the fact that you're not really obsessing beyond actually just trying to minimize the damage. You're not obsessing about things being absolutely perfect. You wouldn't do that anyway when you were tracking anyway, because you've got live musicians doing unpredictable things together.
Right.
And the whole point of a session is that you're not obsessing about little tiny things, because the most important thing is the fact that there are some people performing there together, hopefully having a great time, and you are the only impact you're having on that situation is to make them have a better time. By removing the technology from their lives and making it that when they come through to the control room, you turn up the monitors and they go, wow, we sound good. If you can just do that, make sure they have a good time, and make sure that when they come through, you can turn it up and go, here it is, and they like it.
Yeah. Hey, rock stars. Yeah, you. I've got a secret to tell you. Want to know how I get a consistent sound mixing over 1,000 hours of recording studio rock stars? Well, my secret is using iZotope, RX, Ozone, Neutron, Voice Enhancement Assistant, and Nectar to make every episode of this podcast sound great. Right now, you're hearing RX Breath Control, D-Click, D-Clip, DS, D-Plosive, Voice Denoise, Ozone Multiband Compression, Neutron EQ, VEA, and Limiting, all from iZotope. Use the secret code ROCK10 to get 10% off, or pick up the new Trash Lite along with many of the other free cool plugins over at iZotope.com. More often than not, the musicians are just listening to how they performed anyway. Like the things that you worry about, with your setup and whether it's a perfect mix balance environment, the musicians are just like, am I before the beat, after the beat? Did I hit the right note? Did I fuck up the bridge and forget to go to the G sharp or whatever it is, And
in fact, you make a really good point, because it's actually unrealistic ever to expect musicians to come through to the control room and go, oh, that sounds really good. If they do that, you've hit an absolute home run, but that very rarely happens. The way my barometer for success is that if after the first take, the musicians come through and the first comments are, I don't know, the bass player and the drummer arguing about what part they should do on the middle 8, and the singer going, oh, I wonder whether I should go for that high note. They're not talking about their technology. They're not talking about the sound. They're just talking about their performance. I'm like, I can heave a sigh of relief, because the biggest problem in the world is if the bass player goes, I don't know about that bass sound. Then you're really on the rocks. Because if he's been distracted enough from the fact that he doesn't like what the drummer's doing with his foot, by the fact that his bass doesn't sound the way he wanted it to be, then you're really on thin ice.
All right, so let me jump into some questions here that are kind of coming. Hopefully we'll hit on some of the topics in recording secrets for the home studio. So I think one of the first questions people want to ask is, what should I get? What gear should I get for my studio? I think a lot of times people start with a computer. They've probably already got a computer and they're thinking, what interface should I get? And because you can't listen to this, your music coming off the computer without that. You can, but most people think they need that. And what DAW should I work in? So what are your answers? And let me also phrase it like this. I want to ask you some of the most common questions that you get from your students. So if you think I'm missing the mark on something, just pivot to another common question. But as far as starting out, like what interface should I get? What DAW should I use? What are your answers for those, or what are your thoughts?
DAW doesn't matter, is my quick answer to that. People do great records on any DAW. I've used the Reaper DAW for years, and you can use that practically for free. So if you want to use what I use that, and that's cross-platform.
And it's very flexible.
Yeah,
and
it's very
reliable.
good. Yeah, and very customizable. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of it.
And coming from the very elite of engineers, Reaper is described as rock solid and reliable, a reliable tool.
Yeah. I mean, I was literally just thinking when my computer crashed last. I don't think it's crashed this year. So, yeah. But the interface, the only thing that really matters to me with the interface is what its audio inputs and outputs are, fundamentally, and whether you can rely on the drivers being any good. I mean, if your interface comes from some OEM manufacturer somewhere with a completely unpronounceable name, then you're not sure that they really have any skin in the game in terms of making sure that their drivers are any good. So just get something from a company that you've heard of, because
but you might have to
then they'll
explain what
actually
you mean
have
by
some R&D
drivers.
experience.
You might have to explain what you mean by drivers.
Oh, the drivers. Well, it's the things that it's the bit of software that is that kind of transfers the audio from the interface through whatever interface cable, your USB cable or your Firewire, Thunderbolt, whatever, through into your software. And it's that bit of software and how well it's written that determines how quickly sound gets in and out, and whether you get glitches or unwanted problems with the audio, and potentially how many facilities there are for routing that audio and deciding how it's dealt with before it reaches your DAW and metered and all that kind of stuff. But sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm just looking. I'm trying to read when you're winding down, and I should interject your question. So apologies again if I'm too soon.
But in which case I'll go on. But the in terms of interfacing, so much of that decision is just a question of numbers of inputs and outputs. Project Studio people, I've heard so many good records done on the most bargain basement of gear. I never use very high-end gear for most of the stuff I do, and really, that's not the quality bottleneck. So in a sense, if I was going to answer your broader question, which is what gear should I get, the DAW kind of doesn't matter. The audio interface, heresy of heresies, doesn't really matter. The mic preamps don't really matter. If you get any name brand audio interface, the preamps will be fine. The things that really matter, in my opinion, are the things that touch the air. So the microphones, any acoustic treatment stuff that you have, and the instruments. And of course, on the other side of it, the monitoring hardware, the speakers and the acoustic treatment in your headphones and whatever else. If you spend all your money on that stuff, then the stuff that's in between all that stuff, you can practically do with freeware, and it'll be fine. Fundamentally, actually, that's how I work.
I've never heard anybody use that expression, the things that touch the air. That's great. I love that.
Yeah. I mean, my mix setup is entirely in the box, and the only thing I really spend money on is microphones and monitoring hardware.
Okay.
I don't have any outboard gear or any of that kind of stuff.
So then the next question, how do we start our mic collection? Do we even need mics? Because one of the topics you talk about in the book is this expression of recording a machine as a place to begin learning how things work also.
Well, I mean, the reason I started, this is a brief diversion. I'll get onto the mics in a moment, but the reason I started with recording a machine is just that I saw a lot of people, a lot of students when I covered some student teaching. This must be about 15 years ago. And I saw these students kind of trying to run before they could walk. You know, they'd start putting microphones up on a drum kit before they'd worked out how to line check and get the levels right through the machine and make sure there weren't buzzes and clicks and earth loops and all this kind of stuff. And I think just the surprisingly large amount of stuff that can go wrong even before you get microphones or performers involved. And so recording a machine is just a good way to get all that out of the way so that then when you actually have a drummer there and you have microphones, you're not then worrying about glitches and earth loops and all these other things that just such a downer for the musicians. You got to move quickly. But anyway, back to microphones.
Well, can I add to that? So because that, recording machine throws back a little bit to drum machines, since things that you would plug in to record them. I think you even talked about recording vinyl for those who are sampling off of vinyl records or scratching or any of that. But, I think a starting person now, like the machine is all internal. So people often start with loops and samples inside the computer. But I do think that can still be a good place to start, because if you learn, there are drum sample things, Superior Drummer, these kind of tools that, Battery from Native Instruments, tools that can create a kit that sounds like a real drum kit. So you can start by programming that, even just Logic Drummer,
Yeah.
And then if you learn what those sounds are, you become familiar with them, then you can go mic up a drum kit and at least have, like you said, a vision for like, how do I get a kick drum to sound like that? How do I get a snare drum to sound like that?
Yes.
It can give you a good starting place.
Yes. And in fact, that's why I recommend to people that if they're going to start learning about audio production in a general sense, that they learn to mix first, which seems like back to front. But if you learn to mix, that's what gives you the impression of what it is you need to know when you record. Like I said, the recording book came from me tearing my hair out trying to fix all these problems that people were making themselves while they were recording and trying to head that off. And so if you learn to mix first, that's what the multitrack library's for. Learn to mix first, that'll tell you what it is you need to make your mixing process easy. So then when you go and record, you'll know that.
Okay, so go ahead and interject that. When you briefly said that's what the multitrack library was for. Let the rock stars know what you're talking about.
Well, this is because more than 10 years now, I've been creating, I continue to expand the web's largest database and download site for free multitrack projects, raw multitracks that you can download. They're just WAV files. You can download into any DAW software to practice your own mixing. And then there's a little forum that goes along with that you can then post your mixes and share feedback between different mixes. I often include like an unmastered version of the artist mix so you can practice your mastering as well. But it's just basically a big practice resource so that when you are starting, you don't have to have learnt to record to learn to mix. And then once you've learned to mix, that's the thing that gives you the vision of what it is you need when you record, because you'll have tried to mix something and realized that, no, that set of tracks doesn't work, or when I record a snare to sound that way, that's going to make my life really, really difficult. I'd rather it sounded this way. And then you're not going into recording just guessing. You go, well, no, actually, I know what would be useful for me here if I have this type of sound.
Yeah, like, for example, do you want to pick up a guitar and start playing having heard Hendrix and having a vision for what you'd like your guitar playing to sound like, or just make something up with no idea and maybe sound like the Shags? I'm not sure about that. I don't know if those references are lost on you.
But the Shags are iconic, though.
I know they are. I know. I knew I was setting myself up for a fall with that one. All right, so that's great. So starting out with an understanding of the sound is why it's so useful to start with these immediately available tools. I mean, you don't have to even have an interface to start doing that stuff. You could literally get a computer, download software, plug in headphones, and start learning how to create some sounds that way. Now, if all your sounds are very, very electronic, this may or may not be useful in the same way, because you may never mic up a kick drum to sound like you may never get a bass guitar to sound like a Juno synthesizer, for example.
No. But you'll probably have to record a vocal from time to time.
Right, there you go. So you can get some ideas with vocals. So let's start there. Yeah. So what mic I might use, what way I might approach it. Yeah. However, wherever hearing a vocal and then deciding I'm going to go record a vocal, wherever that takes you. Okay. I think a lot of the way in which people record vocals
is pretty well known now. But I think I see a lot of people not getting the best out of the kind of traditional large diaphragm condenser mic, pop shield, about 6 inches away. There are a lot of things that people do that mean that they don't get the best out of that. Particularly, and this is one of the biggest things, is sticking the microphone exactly on the level of your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because that if your sibilants, your S's and ch and sh sounds, they tend to come out in a plane along the level of your lips. So if you stick your large diaphragm condenser mic directly on that line, you've got the brightest bit of the mic's pickup response, which is directly on axis, pointing directly at this overemphasized sibilant. So you get a problem straight away before you've even, before you even try and mix anything.
Yeah.
So if I could just give one bit of advice is just move your microphone a little bit off axis. I mean, I usually have it, 4 or 5 inches up from my lip line. Another thing I think people do far too often is actually record a bit too close to the mic.
Mm-hmm.
Much better to get a few more quilts and duvets to dry up the sound. Put them behind you. A lot of people put it at the wrong side of the mic. A reflection filter's not going to help you here.
Right.
Put them behind you because it's the reflections coming into the sensitive side of the mic that matter. So
right,
put
it's coming from
a bunch of
behind your
duvets
back.
behind you. Exactly. Put the duvets behind you or above you as well if you can. And then have the microphone maybe even 12 inches away. And the reason to do this is because naturally when you sing, you tend to move a bit. And when you move, if you move side to side, you start moving into the off-axis part of the microphone's pickup, and the frequency balance changes. If you move front and back, you get varying amounts of proximity effect, which is this variable bass boost that increases the closer you get to the microphone.
Mm-hmm.
Most people are using a cardioid microphone, so that's the kind of microphone that does that. So if you're, let's say, 4 inches from the microphone, and you move just a little bit naturally, side to side, or in and out in relation to the mic, you're gonna your tone of your vocal is gonna be like there's some maniac waggling an EQ controls the whole time in real time while you're singing. Whereas if you're 12 inches off a microphone, you can move around a little bit, and those variations are very small.
Right.
And so it immediately makes it so much more consistent to mix the thing.
What do songwriters, music producers, DJs, EDM, TV, and film composers all have in common with you and me? We all crave captivating sounds that elevate our music to the next level. That's why Native Instruments is your ultimate creative companion, offering a vast library of sounds for your studio. Whether you're crafting hip-hop beats, indie pop melodies, classic rock anthems, serene meditation tracks, pulsating dance floor hits, or intricate orchestral compositions, Native Instruments' complete bundle has you covered. From drums, loops, and beats to dynamic synths, lifelike strings, and vintage instruments like electric bass, guitars, and keys. The possibilities are endless. Use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off, or download the free gifts waiting for you, like the awesome new Jacob Collier Audience Choir and Complete Start featuring 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of samples over at nativeinstruments.com. In 2024, Adam Audio will celebrate 25 years of researching, developing, and manufacturing industry-leading monitoring solutions in Berlin. To mark this milestone, our friends at Adam Audio are unveiling a very special limited edition series of monitors that will look gorgeous in your studio and sound as awesome as your music. Introducing the Arctic White A4V and A7V series, available for a limited time to pro and home studio owners like yourself. The clean, glossy white finish exudes a decadent feel and will stand out in any studio or in-home audio system. Featuring the XART accelerated ribbon tweeter design and customizable speaker voicings, the Arctic White A4V and A7V have the full specifications of the original design. Plus, with SonarWorks integration for automated room correction, you can fine-tune your monitors to your control room's acoustics. Plus, with SonarWorks integration for automated room correction, you can fine-tune your monitors to your control room's acoustics. Atom Audio's commitment to delivering professional-grade, high-fidelity sound to studios worldwide has made these monitors a perfect fit for Grammy-winning producers in both pro and home studios for a quarter of a century. Now you can bring that beautiful high-fidelity sound to your own productions and make your studio look as amazing as your music. Don't miss out on the new limited edition Arctic White A4V and A7V monitors, available for a short time with an extended 5-year warranty at atomaudio.com. Howdy, Rockstars. We're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Mike Sr., joining us from Munich. He's not actually in the Hofbrauhaus, but he's not too far away from it. Apparently it's snowy. Mike, you ready to jam, dude?
I'm more ready to jam than I have been in my entire life. Now that I play bass guitar, now that I've been learning Nashville numbers, I'm
Are you
primed.
learning Nashville numbers?
Oh, I'm telling you, I'm disgusted with myself that I've waited this late to learn them. But I've been doing like open mic nights and stuff.
Great,
and
man.
It seems like every other person is doing a song in a different key. So now all the songs I learn, I'm learning in Nashville numbers, and it's an absolute godsend. Love them.
I find it's super helpful that I learned it for writing out charts when I get into the studio with a band to do a song. And it's usually a band of my friends, and usually these are the same friends where we all everybody had their own little ridiculous scribble technique, or everybody's just trying to hold the whole song in their head, So it's like we'd spend the whole session just trying to learn the arrangement. And by the time we kind of all knew the arrangement, nobody could play the song anymore. And so it's been so much more effective to just write down
Admit it was just an excuse to get around and get drunk.
Oh, it was, yeah. Well, and there were a lot of donuts and coffees involved too.
There you go.
All right, so we were talking about vocals, and one of the things that I'm reminded of, and I mention it sometimes on the show, is and this is because I've been doing more singing too, is how striking of a difference it is, your experience when you're singing and you've got headphones on, and you discover things like, if the headphones are down quiet, then I can hear my natural head voice. If they're turned up a little, if they're really cranked up, then all I hear is the headphones, and maybe I have to crank up my mic in the mix, and I hear that, and that sounds cool. But sometimes there's a middle ground gain where the headphones are just about as loud as my natural head voice is, and then you start noticing that the sound in the earphones and your natural head voice can actually phase cancel each other out a little bit, which throws you off too.
Yeah.
So, it reminds me that might be part of the reasons why we lean into the mic for that getting closer and closer too, is just because we can't hear ourselves.
Yes. I mean, you touch on one of the most challenging things with recording vocals is not the microphones, it's how you do the monitoring. And it's an absolute nest of vipers. There's so many different ways of doing it, and different people have different approaches, and whatever method you use has pros and cons. It's whether you use software monitoring, whether you kind of go through your DSP mixer and your sound card, or whether you split the input in the analog domain and listen analog. And then you add things shall I add comfort effects in there, reverb and things?
Right.
It so rapidly gets really, really complicated. And that's before you start talking about cool things like loudspeaker monitoring when you're doing vocals, which is a great thing.
Yeah.
But honestly, if I were going to give any advice to people recording vocals, my advice would be switch the software monitoring, any vocal monitoring off. Don't have it in your headphones at all. Take one headphone can off your ear and listen to yourself acoustically. And it's usually worthwhile then to take whatever monitoring backing track and put it in mono and pan it to the opposite ear cup so it's not bleeding out into the room from the ear cup that's waggling around free. Honestly, it just makes life so much easier if you can just get into the discipline of hearing a backing track in one ear and hearing your own voice acoustically in the room.
Right.
You're tuning me better, and you just don't have to faff with any of that stuff that can potentially put a spanner in the works, latency problems or, problems with effects or whether you've got the right level in your mix or not. It's just, life's too short.
To get stuck on that other
obviously,
stuff.
yeah. It's life's too short. Just get on with it and get used to performing that way. I mean, the one thing you have to bear in mind, though, is if you're going to record like that, you need to make sure that you actually have what I like to call acoustic monitoring in place. Make sure that there is some kind of surface somewhere fairly close by to reflect your voice back on yourself. And now this is something, now you may think I'm speaking through the top of my head here, but this is something that a very simple test will show you exactly how much of a difference this makes. If you take a copy of my book, for example, take a copy of any book that is of a reasonably large size, do some speaking and just put that book up maybe 6 inches in front of your face while you're talking, and listen to how much different it sounds.
Do you hear the effect if I'm sticking it up on the Zoom camera so it's in your face? I guess I'm misinterpreting that. Sorry. I don't know.
Just because that early reflection from a hard surface, you hear so much more information.
Yeah.
In fact, this is something I even say to vocalists sometimes when they're preparing to record and they're not used to recording. To get used to the way in which their vocal will come across through a microphone, because they don't normally hear that because their voice points the other direction than their ears are, sing about 6 inches away from a wall. And so you hear it come straight back off the wall. In the same way that, I say to guitarists, get used to having your amp up on a stand or pointing at your head, not pointing at your knees. Otherwise, you're going to set your drive settings wrong. You've got to actually know what you're hearing. So if you're going to record without monitoring in the headphones, have some kind of surface, even if it's just like a clipboard on a music stand or something, quite close to you, so that you can hear an early reflection. It'll give you an idea of actually what your voice is sounding like and the details of the high frequencies that you don't normally hear because they go out into the room and disappear.
Now, have you heard anybody do studies or demonstrate that early reflection actually informs pitch as well?
Oh, I don't know. The pitch is a really, really tricky one. I've done a lot of research. I mean, as you can see from the book, I've kind of got 200 producers in that book. I've done a lot of research into what different producers think about topics like this.
Yeah.
And it seems like there are as many producers who say one thing about pitching as who say the other thing. The thing like, oh, if the vocal's loud, then that means people go flat. Or other people will say, well, no, if the vocal's too loud, that means they go sharp. Or,
right.
You've got to make sure they're loud enough, otherwise they can't pitch well enough. I think it must have to do with a lot of factors at once, and that it's not simple to work it out. In a sense, taking out the whole electronic element and, like you say, the issue of phase cancelling between what's coming through your headphones and what's coming through the bones in your head through bone conduction, that can simplify things a little bit. I think I don't. It's so difficult to know what things for specific singers are going to cause problems.
Well,
with
you
pitching.
said it's hard to have a simple solution. So I think you're right. It's hard to find one universal solution, but it's actually not hard to find a simple solution because the answer is know what the 5 different variations are and just try them all. That's what I do on sessions.
Yes.
I'm like, try one ear off. Okay, if it sounds worse, put the one ear back on again. Let's turn your headphones up. Let's turn them down.
Yeah.
Just try a variety of things until you find what feels
I 100% agree with you. And there are so many different ways of doing it. This is why I said it's a kind of a nest of vipers. There's so many different ways of doing it, but that can work in your favor if you have pitching problems or something like that. What I would say, though, is that I think if pitching is a real concern, if you're someone who doesn't get along with headphones, and some singers just don't, then my secret weapon is definitely loudspeaker foldback.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Like, how do we set that up in our home studio to make that? And first of all, what the hell is loudspeaker foldback?
Loudspeaker
we've
foldback
talked about gaffing. I think there was like throw a spanner in there, and now we've got foldback. What in the world is going on?
Foldback. It's just a generic term for the signal you send to the performer so that they can hear what they're doing.
It's the same thing as an AUX channel, a Q channel. It's just a send.
Exactly. People have different words for it, but it's that thing that you send to the artist so they can hear what they're doing.
Yeah. Or
and
a
it usually
bus
has
in
the
Pro
backing
Tools, I
track in
guess.
it, and it might have some signal from them depending on whether they need to hear themselves or not.
Right. Okay.
But with loudspeaker foldback, rather than giving them headphones, you put a loudspeaker in the same room as them and their microphone, so they're hearing acoustically in the room what they're singing along to. And a lot of Project Studio people are very worried about doing this because they're like, oh, well, won't I get lots of loudspeaker spill through into my microphone? And in practical terms, in most productions, that doesn't matter very much. I mean, there are a large number of really famous records where the lead vocals were recorded like that.
Wow.
I mean, Bono always records like that, as I understand it.
I've not
JK
heard that.
recorded like that a lot of the time. The guy from, I think, Free recorded like that a lot of the time. Lots of people record like that. And in the main thing is that you can't afford to be recording something that is, or recording to a backing track that is substantially different than the thing you actually want to end up in the mix. I mean, you can't have click track in loudspeaker monitoring, obviously, because you won't be able to completely remove that from the loudspeaker foldback. Now, all of that said, there are tricks you can use to reduce the amount of loudspeaker spill that gets into your microphone. Obviously, you can stick the microphone in the dead spot of, stick the speaker in the dead spot of whatever microphone you happen to be using, behind a cardioid or to the side of a figure of 8. You can also, I mean, this is a trick some people talk about. I'm not a huge fan of it myself, but you can have 2 speakers and have them out of phase with each other and equal distance to the microphone. Mm-hmm. The idea being that the sound will kind of cancel out at the microphone. But I've never found it that effective. The most effective method of getting rid of spill is to record your vocal take. And then when you've done, or your vocal takes, and when you've done your vocal takes, make sure that you never move the microphone or the speaker relative to each other. And then at the end of the session, record a single pass where the singer doesn't sing or say anything and just stands there. And then what you can do is you can take that recording, you can invert its polarity, and use that to cancel out the speaker spill from any of the other takes.
Fascinating.
And it is amazingly effective.
Wow! I've
actually got audio examples on my site that demonstrate how well it works. And I've actually heard worse headphone spill from headphone foldback than some of the examples I've done using speaker foldback.
Now, where do we want to find that? Is that just, we're going again to Cambridge MT.MT?
Yes. I mean, I have so many kind of resources and stuff these days that I think what I'll do is I'll create a special page, which is just cambridge-mt.com/rockstars. Just put that in and I'll just list all the kind of free resources and stuff. And anything we've talked about here, I'll put links to, because there are audio examples for everything.
Very exciting stuff.
I am Mr. Audio Example, as you know.
Yeah, no, it's really great. And let me say that back to the Rockstars too. So essentially we have, let's just say we're taking one extra powered speaker that's in our, let's do it this way. Let's just assume that we're in a home studio that just has a pair of speakers and that's all we got. Yeah. We're singing in the control room. So we might mute one of our speakers and then...
You can use both of them.
Well, let me start with muting the one. Okay, unless you really don't think it matters, in which case
it doesn't matter at all.
Okay,
as long as the speakers and the microphone stay in the same positions.
So we're going to put the microphone where we want, and we're going to have the speakers. We're probably not going to crank the speakers super loud, but maybe that doesn't matter either. I don't know.
It doesn't really, but it's better to have them a bit quieter if you can.
All right, so we're going to have our vocal mic set up. Probably we're near the screen because we're probably running the keyboard to punch ourselves into record and stuff. And our speakers are going, and we record our vocals, and the music that is as close as possible to what we think that final mix is going to... Actually, it doesn't have to even be that. It just has to be it shouldn't have elements that don't exist at all, like a click track in what's going to be the final mix.
You just got to make sure that because you can't drop things out of your monitor spill.
So we're going to have that music playing. Our voice is not coming back through the speakers. Our voice is muted. We're singing into the mic. And when we're done singing, we stay exactly in the same spot because our head and our body in front of the mic are part of what's creating the sound.
Yes.
And then we don't even change the volume of the sound, the music coming out of the speakers. And we record it one more time from beginning of song to end of song. We record the music out of the speakers into our vocal mic. We don't say, "Oh, bird." We stay totally quiet. And what that is we're creating a copy of an isolated copy of the music bleed or spill that's going into our vocal mic. And that allows us to flip the polarity on it and mix it back with our vocal take. And it's going to cause the music that was positive when we were singing our vocals. Now we're inverting it and mixing, but blending back in the negative music only with that. And so what we'll be left with is just our voice.
Yeah, that's the principle.
Pretty close
it never
to it.
works. It never works perfectly, but it works amazingly well.
That's really cool.
A lot better than you think it should. A lot better than you feel it has any right to work is how well it works. And if you combine that with other common sense stuff, like, try and put the speakers in the null point of the microphone and, make sure you're not in a hugely reflective space, which you wouldn't want to be anyway with vocals. Right. There's stuff that you can do, and try not to have it monitoring too loud. Another thing you can do to help is make it so that the monitoring signal isn't too bright, because the phase cancellation effect gets less effective the further up the frequency spectrum you get.
Right. The highs are more randomized,
yeah.
in other words.
So if you low pass filter at, say, 8 kilohertz, that's still going to give you a perfectly good loudspeaker monitoring signal, but you'll get better spill reduction then when you do the cancellation process.
Okay, that's very cool. I'm going to have to try this out. That sounds like a lot of fun, because it is fun to sing to speakers. We naturally sing better. In fact, when I work with a vocalist and we're trying to figure out what to do, usually this is related to background vocals where people are like hunting for a part or hunting for a harmony. The first thing I do is bring them into the control room, and it's like, let's just work it out in here and then go out to the mic, because it's so common for people to become disoriented on a microphone once they're out in headphones. They forget what their note is, all that kind of stuff.
I mean, fundamentally, most musicians hate headphones. I as a recording engineer, I go to tremendous lengths to try and avoid people having to use headphones wherever I can. I mean, I can see they're not nice.
I'm wearing headphones right now, and I think you have one earbud in, so you're already
yes.
like avoiding.
So I'm practicing what I preach, even as a podcaster.
Yeah,
I've got one earbud out.
That's awesome. That's probably why I'm interrupting you, but that's all right. Apologies again, Rockstars. Okay, cool.
Also, just a quick one that I was thinking as you were talking about the issue of on headphones of speaker feedback interfering and comb filtering with the bone conduction through your head. We were talking about polarity. A very, very quick fix sometimes for that is to flip the polarity button on your vocal mic.
Right.
And a lot of people forget this because it doesn't really make any practical difference to the sound of the vocal track that you record, but it will make a difference to what the foldback signal sounds like in combination with the bone conduction in your head. And that on its own can sometimes fix pitching problems and things.
It can make your vocals sound a little louder to you in the low mid frequencies in your headphones. And the first time I discovered that, I had repaired a figure 8 microphone, and I brought it back in the control room, and I was listening with headphones, and I talked into the front of the mic, and I was like, okay, cool, it's working. I talked in the back, and I was like, oh no, it's not working. They messed it up. It's what's wrong with this? The mic's not sounding
horrible.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I realized, I thought about it for a second. So I was like, oh shit. Yeah, the front of the mic is a positive polarity, and I'm hearing that, and the back of the mic is negative. And that's when I discovered, I was like, oh, wow, it sounds really different in the headphones. And I've been recording people and sticking headphones on them all these years and never even realized that.
Yeah. But I mean, that's the story of anyone's life as a recording engineer, isn't it? I mean, I found this from writing the book. I mean, inevitably, as a recording engineer, you have certain things that you naturally have experience in and other things you don't. And if you're going to write a book about something, you have to fill holes in your knowledge. So there are bits where I was doing research and going, crumbs, I've been doing that wrong for years. And I need to change the way I do this. And, that really matters. And I didn't realize. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. So let's talk about some other stuff for vocals. Now, you already mentioned duvets. Anything more you want to say about just treating spaces for vocal takes?
Oh, I've got a big one. And this is, if again, this it's like these golden bits of information that please take my advice here. Don't ever record in a vocal booth or try and make a vocal booth for yourself in a Project Studio environment. Professional studios have professionally designed booths, and they're not tiny, and they have huge amounts of acoustic treatment, and they're very carefully designed, and even those ones can sound a bit odd.
Right.
If you try and create your own vocal booth by creating some kind of a telephone box and then putting an inch of foam all the way around the inside and a couple of egg boxes, it's going to sound horrible because for a variety of reasons. One, it's going to suck all the high-frequency information out of the room, but none of the mid-range and the low end. It's going to add a whole bunch of resonances, and because the room's so small, they're all going to be in the vocal range, and it's going to make you sound boxy and horrible, and I kind of shudder whenever I see a vocal booth in anyone's home studio. Much, much better to get out into a bigger room, into your control room, whatever, and stick some duvets up behind you to absorb any reflections. That will be amply dry enough for any modern production.
Yeah. So
I'm glad I got that off my chest. It's hideous if you get a recording like that. They're really difficult to record, to mix rather.
You make a great point, which is that in these small spaces, all this room treatment goes up, but the room treatment inevitably treats the high frequencies down to mid frequencies, down to some of the, upper low mids, but below maybe 300 hertz or something like that. It almost
it's even harder than that.
Yeah, 500 or something.
If it's like a couple of inches of acoustic foam, the thin foam panels, they'll go down to 500 hertz.
Yeah.
Maximum.
Which means that everything below that is as if there's no treatment and it's all this boomy, boxy thing. So you're almost exaggerating the sound of the closet space.
Yeah, of course. Then where all the resonances and nasty colorations from this tiny space are.
Right. And being out in the big room, being out in the big room with the vocal mic means that there's more room for the frequencies to breathe, and the low resonances drop to much lower low notes, which are out of the way of being problematic.
That's absolutely it.
Or fall within what you would low cut anyway on the vocal. And and then 100%. The duvet stuff just kind of keeps the splashy reflections from bouncing off the walls. And so when you talk about don't convert a closet to a vocal booth, the vision that popped into my head was one of those old British telephone booths. And it occurred to me that unless you're Doctor Who and you own the TARDIS, which you that'd probably be a great place to convert to a vocal booth because it's infinitely large space inside, right?
Yeah.
But not our real world vocal booths. Awesome. All right.
You get those strange kind of Doctor Who sound effects on your vocal recording. So
that's the sonic screwdriver. That's
the one. Yeah,
that's we covered that in Recording Machines. We learned. Well, we didn't really, but in the book he does cover it. Mike, you talk about avoiding ground loops and buzzes and excessive noise in recordings and all that stuff in the first part of the book.
Yes. In a sense, although I suggest learning about audio with mixing, it's actually the recording book where I deal with most of the kind of basics of just cables and plug sockets and different interfaces and gain management and all the kind of boring but really important stuff that you want to have sorted out and have out of the way before you invite anyone in to actually get on and make some music, because you want to be concentrating on musical stuff and not on technical stuff.
I am super impressed with iZotope Ozone. I've been mastering many of my records recently, and Ozone makes it so easy to get a fantastic sound. The built-in mastering assistant helps by measuring the mix and suggesting all the settings needed for a professionally mastered result based on the genre and EQ curve of your choice. You can even reference a specific song if you want. Using simple yet sophisticated modules like Clarity, Impact, Low-End Focus, Stabilizer, Imager, Exciter, and Spectral Shaping, along with powerful dynamic EQ, compression, and limiting, you simply adjust adjust the settings to your own taste, and it sounds incredible. And the magic of master rebalance means that you can reach into your mix at the mastering stage and manipulate the vocal, bass, and drums. Amazing. My bandmates are pretty demanding of my mixes, but now when I send off the masters for approval, the band absolutely loves the way our records sound thanks to Isotope and Ozone. Use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off Ozone or other tools like RX and Voice Enhancement Assistant, or grab any of the cool free plugins like the new Trash Light over at isotope.com. So let's begin with do you have a collection of quick tips for hanging duvets and things like that? Just basic stuff for how to treat a space?
For recording purposes?
Yeah, for recording purposes, yeah.
I think it depends a little bit on the kind of instrument you're recording. If you're recording lead vocals, usually for most styles, you want those to be as dry as possible. So you can't have too many duvets.
Right.
But just don't get yourself in a tiny space so you don't get the resonances. With something like acoustic guitar, if you do that with acoustic guitar, you're going to suck all the life out of the acoustic guitar.
Right.
Most wooden-bodied instruments have extremely complicated dispersion patterns. In other words, they send different frequencies out in different directions in a way that is almost impossible to predict from instrument to instrument. There are some general principles, but there's a lot of randomness about it from instrument to instrument. If you record that in a completely dry space and try and put a mic in front of it, you get this really paltry subset of the information that it puts out. So actually something like an acoustic guitar, you don't want to record it somewhere where there's loads of reverb or an obvious kind of
that kind
of
cool.
sound. Well, unless it sounds good. But you want some early reflections. You want some hard surfaces around. Pull the carpet away. Have a few offcuts of wood around the place, reflecting a few alternative angles of the acoustic guitar into the microphone, so that you get a more holistic picture at your microphone of this incredibly complex three-dimensional dispersion pattern of the instrument.
Yeah.
So different instruments require different things. Something like, I don't know, a saxophone has a comparatively predictable dispersion pattern. You can afford to be in a slightly drier environment there, but then you record a drum kit, actually you're going to want a lot of the reflections of the room. Otherwise, your drums aren't going to sound like drums. They're going to sound, as I said before, they're going to sound like doink.
Yeah, exactly. That's what happens when you record drums outside. If you've ever going to have a chance to record drums on a stage and they do the close mics, you're like, whoa, they sound like dead drums,
Yeah.
So that reminds me, like in my studio, the kitchen ISO that doubles as an ISO booth where the coffee maker is, it's sort of a smallish room. It's a little bit broken up with shelving and things. And it gets used as a temporary vocal booth on sessions because you've got a glass, you can look through the door and it gets some isolation. And then sometimes I'll play a good acoustic or do other things in there. But a lot of times we'll go to, okay, now it's time to redo the vocals on something. And I've found that it really sounds cool sometimes to just stay in that room. There can be a quality to small spaces that adds a character and a personality to sounds that you can really love on a recording. And so, and especially with acoustic, like what you're saying, an acoustic guitar can really sound lifeless in some spaces and sound really exciting in others and fun to play. And so Rockstars, I would encourage you to take advantage of all these rooms that might be in your house, for example, and walk around, listen, what does it sound like when I play acoustic in the kitchen, the bathroom, my bedroom, the living room, and then, choose to record in your favorite spot where you like the sound of it the best. And speaking of which, now you can hear the sound of the neighborhood dogs.
The kind of most foolproof way to record vocals, and in a sense, the entry-level way is this very dry way. But there are plenty of really great vocals and well-known vocals that use slightly more advanced methods of doing it using reflections. I mean, one of the most famous examples is probably Michael Jackson, because Bruce Swedien recorded him in a kind of a forest of little circular reflectors. Because it enabled him
too.
Yeah, because it enabled him to get a more consistent sound out of him as he moved around while he was dancing in front of the microphone.
Right. So talk about what that is. Break that down.
Well, I mean, again, this is something that's not that easy to do in a Project Studio environment. But basically, they're like tube traps. They have a reflective side and an absorptive side, I think. And he would just set up a bunch of those behind Michael Jackson when he was recording at a microphone. So then as he was moving around, because so much of the sound was being created with these early reflections, not just from the direct sound, as he was moving around, his sound varied less because it was coming from all these different sources. You're getting all these reflections rather than just the direct signal from the microphone. It's like we were talking about earlier. You get tonal changes as you move around in relation to a microphone. But, I mean, that's certainly not the only example. I mean, the one I always think of is the Stereophonics, Kelly Jones of the Stereophonics. When they were doing their kind of breakout record, their second album, they recorded a bunch of the lead vocals in the Stone drum room. Because, exactly the same as you were saying with your kitchen, because the bright reflections they were getting off the stone in the room was actually enhancing the vocal in a useful way.
That's very cool. That's such a cool concept. And I hadn't thought about it in that context, but it makes perfect sense. If the sound isn't just coming from you anymore, then as you move about a little bit, the larger percentage of sound is still coming from the room or the space or the reflections, and it will make it sound.
And actually, if we go back to our acoustic guitar example, if you have an acoustic guitar in a really dead space, what you'll find is that as you try and find a mic position, small changes in miking position, and indeed small movements of the player, will have a much bigger impact on the sound of that microphone than if you have some early reflections that kind of average it out a bit. It makes it a lot easier to find a good mic position when there's some early reflections involved.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. Well, let's talk about another question, because I think sometimes people get bent out of shape about this idea of parallel walls. Do we care about that? Do we need to worry about that stuff? Where and when does it even matter as far as just walls and these shapes of rooms that we're in?
It's in a sense, it's a broader question of acoustics in general while you're recording. And I always remember this story. There was an absolutely crazy tech guy who used to work at one of the studios that I kind of earned my stripes in. And he used to take people on tours of the studio to show them where they were going to record. And one of the big selling points of this particular studio was this big, like, old ballroom, a literal ballroom in a manor house, which did great drum sounds. It was a big room. And one engineer came round and was doing the thing of like clapping his hands in different areas of the room. And then he clapped his hand in one area of the room as he went, oh, bit of a flutter echo. And quick as a flash, this tech guy comes back, goes, well, best not record there then. which there's actually a lot of truth in that. It's like you can get very hung up on thinking about, oh, my room isn't flat, my room's got resonances, my room's got problems with it. And if it does, go, okay, those things you can use to your advantage if you wish. If there's a flutter echo in one part of your room, move somewhere else. And the thing with parallel walls, to get back to the actual question you asked, the biggest problem with parallel walls or parallel surfaces in general is going to be flutter echo, which is when high frequencies bounce back and forth between parallel hard surfaces. And the easy way to spot that is by clapping your hands. Yeah. If you clap your hands and it rings, has that kind of slightly down a drain pipe kind of sound, that implies that there's this high frequency resonance. It's dead easy to fix by just sticking a duvet on one of the walls because it's high frequencies and they're really easily absorbed.
Right, so and you don't have to do both walls.
No, just have to do one. One's fine.
What about the reverse? What if you hear that sound and you're like, that's cool. Have you ever tried to capture it? And have you learned any tricks for how to actually record a flutter?
As long as you can hear it, you can pick it up. I would have thought.
Yeah, just stick the mic where your head was or something.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, because sometimes those weird things are, the secret sauce sounds for a recording where you get unusual sounds in a space.
100%. I mean, it's a weird one because I find myself talking often a lot about trying to record things so that they're faithful reproductions, or that you're achieving some sound you're looking for and that you're trying to get something that has fidelity to it. Because in a sense, that's the most difficult job. And sometimes I get the impression that people think that I'm this kind of purist who just likes things to sound the way they do, and that's the only way. But the only reason I end up harping about that is that that's usually where people come to me asking for help. They go, well, my drum kit doesn't sound like my drum kit. Can you make it sound more like my drum kit? Whereas, obviously, there are so many really cool ways to get really interesting new sounds. In fact, for the second edition of the recording book, I actually added a section about one of my favorite new methods of getting really cool new sounds, which is contact microphones.
Oh, yeah, those are fun. Yep.
And
so tell us about
the stuff you can do with contact microphones is great. I mean, you could just the fact that you can fix them to studio window or to a lampshade or a cardboard box, and the sympathetic vibrations in that substance or in that object will then get transferred through to the contact mic, and they themselves will act effectively like a kind of mechanical filter. A bit like, I mean, you think of it with something like a plate reverb. Mm-hmm. The sound of a plate reverb is the sound of vibrations being transmitted to this metal plate and then being picked up by contact microphones. But you can put contact microphones like that on anything. You can put it on a carrot and pick up the sound filtered through a carrot. It is such fun. And in addition, if you get good contact mics, in fact, there's a company called Zeppelin Design Labs that do some great ones called the Cortados. They're really, really good alternative to DIs. And I found them particularly good for things like upright bass or acoustic guitar in live performance environments, because unlike a DI, they pick up some of that kind of body resonance and wooden character of the instrument, particularly, and again, this is a big hack, if you use a pair of them. The problem with contact mics is that, you know the problem you get when you put a microphone too close? You pick up only a small amount of the instrument. Well, a contact mic is the end point of that. That's the most possible close miking position, because you're stuck to a specific bit of the instrument. So if you can have a couple of different contact mics, it's a bit like multi-miking, and you get more of the natural sound of the instrument. And I've had some really good acoustic guitar sounds from just the contact mics. It's such fun.
I'm looking at this Zeppelin Design Labs website right now, and they've got a lot of cool-looking stuff on here.
They have a great
I guess some of these are mods too, right?
Stuff.
Oh, there's a Macchiato mini synth digital synthesizer kit for $22. Build your own synth, something like that. Wow.
I mean, they actually have a kit version of the Cortado that's really inexpensive. But even if you get the ones that are built by them and that are really nicely built, they're not expensive either. And they're great.
I can see it right there. It looks cool.
I've got 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah, I got some, and I've tried experimenting with contact mics and different things. You could stick it to a snare drum and record that if you want. I mean, that sounds pretty crazy.
Yeah, you can use them. Obviously, you can use them for triggers. That's really useful in a general sense.
Right.
But I just love the fact that they create a surprisingly nice sound from like wooden-bodied instruments in particular.
And then, electric guitars, sometimes, like if you have a clamp or something, or you can stick it to the body of a guitar, it can be another guitar sound. It reminds me a little bit, Frank Zappa would, famously had this blended guitar sound of piezo pickups. Yeah, I think they were maybe installed under his bridge like an acoustic, but blended in with the pickups, and you get this cool, like, twangy attack on the guitar note and then that blends with the amp sound. But then I did it also where we clamped it to the piano one time using just like, I had these plastic spring clamps from the wood shop, and you could just
It's exactly what I use too.
Clamp it down, and then we ran that out to a guitar amp and then put that through the tube reverb, and it was this great effect on all the piano notes. And you just kind of separate it. But I wonder if anybody's, you said you could stick a contact mic on anything. And of course, my mind goes directly to like, oh, what happens if you stick it right on the speaker cone in the control room?
You could. I mean, you could stick it to your head and like chew stuff, and you get crazy kind of Foley.
Really?
It's fabulous. I stuck it to a piece of toast and buttered the toast.
Oh, well, that sounds like a good YouTube channel right there.
It's such fun. I mean, I did a whole review of it, and I did audio examples. Again, I'm Mr. Audio Example, so I'll stick a link to those audio examples on the page.
Okay, that's awesome. That's awesome. All right, so let's jump to some other things that you had to say about recording I think this might have been related to vocals, but it's kind of related to everything. So we had topics like posture and movement. We had topics like visual inspiration and actually getting into the spirit of the thing you're about to record. I think that's a novice error many of us make, where we are, we have an excitement about what we want to do. And then, but by the time we've set up a mic and recorded ourselves, we've thrown in so many curveballs that we don't even realize we're preventing ourselves from letting that performance come through. Talk a little bit about some of the ways that you've included in the book for helping us encourage a great performance on the microphone.
Well, I mean, in a sense, we've talked about one of them straight away, which is simply getting the technology out of the way. That's why I harp on about all this kind of stuff early in the book. Also, I mean, just thinking about it, I mean, people spend a lot of time talking about gear and a lot of time talking about mic technique, and not enough time talking about, okay, how do you actually deal with a person in a room when you're trying to get takes out of them? How do you indicate to them that you need another take? How do you pace the session? It's often, how you decide to record your vocalist will depend on how experienced they are, how used to recording they are, what their views about recording are. For one singer, it may be that you're going to get the best recordings out of them by doing takes of the complete song. For most singers that you deal with in project studios, that's not actually going to work that well, because there'll be certain areas of the song that they'll find more difficulty with than with others. Mm-hmm. So if you just do run-throughs straight through the song, they're going to tire out before you get enough good takes of the difficult bits.
And remember this, Rockstar, that difficult bit is probably later in the song as the song builds, which means that you'll have 10 takes that are all pretty good from verse 1 up to the bridge. But then every time the bridge comes, you realize later when you're comping, you're like, oh shit, we never really hit that high note well enough. You know, that kind of thing.
It's very common for the first phrase of any section you're recording also to be not quite right, or the first note. Yeah. But this is one of my big hacks for vocal recording, is to tell the vocalist, if you've got a note you're starting on, to make sure that you hit it properly and that it's actually the right note, sing it a couple of bars before. Start singing that note first, and then so your voice is in the right kind of tension before you actually have to produce that note for the beginning of the take you're going to do. And sometimes if it's like, I don't know, there's a certain word or something they sing at the beginning of the take, I say, well, just do those couple of words 2 bars earlier. And oftentimes I'll take the one that they did in the warm-up because they just did something cool in the warm-up. But if they didn't, at least then when they get to the take, each take will be usable from the very start as opposed to 3 or 4 syllables in.
And I think you could also do a trick. I mean, I don't really do this very often, but I might try it now. It's like, let's say the first verse is 4 vocal phrases. You could just have them sing the first verse, repeating the first vocal phrase 4 times, because they might be warmed up by that third one, and it's in tune and it's in time and they've got the right tone. But it is one of those little funny things that you don't realize for a while, that the very first vocal note that gets sung in a song, it's like, it's very important that thing grabs you as a listener, but they might not be their best thing yet, because they have, they get better by the chorus or whatever.
Well, I mean, experienced singers will know that they need to kind of get their voice into the right. It's a bit like, imagine, it's probably easier to think of it like playing guitar or even playing a keyboard, right? If you were going to play a keyboard part and you had to start with a certain chord, you'd get your fingers ready over the notes before you had to play it.
Right.
As opposed to starting with your hands in your pockets and then in the time it takes you to take a breath, like with a singer, getting your hands out of your pockets and putting them in the right place on the keyboard.
Right.
You'd probably muck up that first chord or not play it as well as you could. And it's exactly the same with a singer. Experienced singers will naturally go, okay, my voice is going to be in this position straight away so that when I start my first note, I'm absolutely in the right place. But most singers don't really have that experience of recording. They're certainly in a project studio environment. And so they won't be used to doing that. And so you can just trick them into doing it by saying, okay, sing that phrase for me to start with a couple of beats before you actually sing it for real. And the voice is naturally in the place to hit it.
Now let's go to another topic that you brought up, which is hands in your pockets. So
yes.
Talk about posture and movement for a singer, and getting a performance rather than a boring, I don't know what.
Well, for the most part, singing performances tend to be more compelling when you're standing up rather than sitting down. You just have better breath control, if nothing else. Obviously, every type of posture you hold as a singer will affect the way you perform. So if you want a really kind of relaxed and kind of relaxed vocal style or kind of conversational vocal style, then maybe you would sit down. But for the most part, it's best to stand up so that you can actually fill your lungs properly. It's worth getting used to breathing in a sensible way, not raising your shoulders when you take a breath in, just basic things. A couple of singing lessons can help with that. I find it's worth reminding singers that what they do with their hands can affect what happens with their voice. A lot of people, if they're singing under a note, and you say, okay, well, when you sing that note, put your hand in the air and raise it in the air while you're singing that note. And they'll get sharper as they do it. We are naturally quite a visual and physical creature, us humans. And if you do something physically, it'll affect the way your singing happens. It's like if you look a certain direction, you tend to move that direction at the same time. It's the same if you do something physical in terms of smiling, lifting your eyebrows, raising your hand in the air, you'll tend to raise your pitch at the same time.
Do you ever feel like the time that you've spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take you years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Listen to this quote from one of our students, David. Quote, "Absolutely the most informative and helpful block of information and mentoring on the mix process that I've ever been a part of. That was like sitting behind a mix engineer for years, watching and picking up tips along the way, but condensed into a 6 to 7 hour session." Close quote. Look, I'm so confident that this will take your mixes to the next level that if you can't get a killer mix within 30 days, I'll give you a full refund, no questions asked. So if you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then go to ultimatemixingmasterclass.com and start now by checking out the free preview of the Ultimate Snare Mixing Trick. And I'll see you at the front row table of the Grammys. Cheers. It's so true. I mean, even in public speaking, Rockstars, I'm going to reveal something. Even when I record an ad for one of our sponsors, I have to be very careful where I set up the mic because my hands are flying all through the air, and I'm like phrasing each word as I say it with my hand movements, and it's amazing how much that stuff completely helps. The meter of your own voice coming out, the words coming out and stuff. So it'll help with pitch. I mean, I think for me, the realization was like, oh, duh, the whole do, re, mi thing. Why, there's a reason for that, because those hand movements actually help you find the notes.
Yeah. And of course, expression. It helps with expression. It just, I mean, if you speak passionately, I mean, I'm waving my hands around the whole time. If you speak passionately about something, you emphasize words with your hands. And if you consciously do that for emphatic words in the way you sing. Certainly, if you see a lot of talented singers, you'll see them using their hands at certain points to help them bring out their own expression. It's kind of a classic virtuous cycle. Yeah. In fact, another really, really important physical one, and this is for any kind of up-tempo track, is the singer should be dancing with an up-tempo track.
Right.
Even if they're not a dancer, they have to be moving with it, because if they're not moving with it, it's going to sound bored.
It worked for Michael Jackson.
Really important. Yes, absolutely worked for Michael Jackson, but any up-tempo song, if the singer isn't moving, it's going to sound boring.
Yeah, and he went so far as to have them install speakers in the ceiling of the control room, I heard, so that he could stand back and dance to it to decide whether or not the song was any good.
Oh, wow, cool. I can imagine that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Let's go. There was another comment you made too, and this is sort of related to anything, but it was just a simple idea that said, play through the mistakes. Don't stop. You can, and I think I added, you can fix it later with edits or comping, but it is a common thing. Sometimes people are like, they'll start the song and they get this far and they're like, oh, I messed up. Do it over. And like, again, you end up with like 10 takes where like verse 1 up to the chorus or to the second chorus is pretty good, but we don't seem to have anything else in the song after that. And it's just keep going, just keep playing. It's not that hard to go back and fix a small part of something if you have to.
And also, if you're not making mistakes, then you're not trying hard enough. The most exciting performances are the performances that are on the edge of what is possible. I don't want to feel when someone's doing a take that they're playing it safe. The whole point of doing takes and of comping and of all this is so that the person can shoot for the moon, and if they overshoot, no one ever needs to hear that. They can just hear the bit where they did the one thing that they'll never do again because they were being risky. And in fact, in a lot of cases, if I feel that someone isn't taking enough risks, after we've done the takes, the supposedly all the takes that we need, I'll go, okay, I think we've got everything for a master take now. I'm just going to do a couple of run-throughs, and I want you to surprise yourself, surprise me, do things you never thought would be worth using. Just, there's nothing to lose because we've got it. And let's just see whether we get some moment of magic. And really, isn't that what you're looking for, particularly with a vocal recording, any performance? You're looking for those moments where you go, oh, wow, that one moment just elevates the whole performance. One little crack of their voice or little moment where they do a little run or something that couldn't ever be repeated again, that they don't know how they did it. And then you can chop it in.
I thought maybe you were going to say you just open the door to the live room and you throw a snake in there, a poisonous snake, and you hit the record button again. Here you go. Do another take.
Yeah.
Okay, so speaking of which, let's talk about communication with the musicians. What do you want to explain about various forms of communication? We might have a single home studio and we're working with somebody and they're standing right next to us, but we might have them in another room or somewhere a little further away. How should we communicate with people?
As much as possible is the basic answer to that. I think it's very easy, and this is something that can afflict you more and more the more experienced you get. And for some reason, this has always been very clear to me, but it's very easy when you get quite technical yourself to assume that other people have that same understanding and to forget how incredibly intimidating a studio environment, even a home studio environment, can be. The way I try and explain this to people is, imagine your grandmother and you show them Instagram and the way they respond to Instagram. And imagine that the person coming into the studio is responding to all the studio tech and the way you're doing stuff in the studio in the same way that your grandmother is responding to Instagram. If you assume that, then you'll do enough to put them at their ease. Just doing a running commentary of what it is you're doing and what you expect of them. You forget that you stick someone in front of a large diaphragm condenser mic, that most people don't really come into contact with those at all, and they know nothing about it other than this is some bit of black magic studio gear. They don't know that it's $300 and that it's not that expensive. They think this might cost more than my house. They don't want to break it. They don't know what to do with it. They don't want to look a fool. And if you just say to them, okay, this is the microphone we're going to use. We're going to sing into this side of it. And you could do me a real favor if you stay around this far away from it, and I'll let you know what to do. Just those things set a whole bunch of fears aside and open a dialogue, so they then can go, there's this cable over here. I'm not sure what it does. Should that be there? And you go, oh, no, sorry, that's nothing to do with it. I'll move that out of the way. Or, here's a music stand and you can have your music here if you want, but just be careful with the pages. They feel that you're telling them the stuff they need to know so that they can do what they need to do without breaking something or.
Well, there's also the level where you might be pretty fast on your let's say you're working in Pro Tools or Reaper, you might be pretty quick in there, and you might be doing things like punching in and editing and moving things around. And the artists, even if they've had a little bit of experience, they might really not know what's going on, and they might be sort of at a loss for where are we, what's happening now. And so imagine the reverse. Imagine like an advanced composer came in with a string ensemble, and they're all reading sheet music, and they just turn to you and they say, like, drop us in for the C sharp and the third, sonata or whatever. I'm just making this stuff up. And you have no idea what that is, You would be so stressed out, and so that's it. The musicians might feel the same way when you're in your comfort zone of like flipping around on the screen, programming things, recording stuff. So it really does help
100%.
to let people know what's going on and being patient. On the other hand, I've also worked with artists when they know what they want, and the last thing they want is for me to jump in on the talkback and make another comment on the last take. It's just like, dude, just keep rolling it, man. Let me just sing. Trying to do my thing.
But usually those kinds of artists, you're pretty quick to work it out.
Yeah.
If they have that kind of experience. But to be honest, in project studio environments, most of the time you're not dealing with professional session musicians. You're dealing with amateur musicians of various types. People whose day job is not yet being a rock star. They aspire to being a rock star. They're doing lots of music on the side, but that's not, they spend most of their time performing live and writing songs, and they don't actually often find themselves in front of a mic with headphones on or dealing with this recording stuff.
Yeah.
They're musicians. They're not technicians.
So let's use that example. Let's say you're recording a local band.
Yes.
What have you learned about how to communicate with a local band? Because it sounds like a dumb question until you're actually on a session and you're like, God damn it, the drummer can't hear me. I can't hear what he's saying back. What the hell is the bass player? Nobody's heard anything he's said all day long because he doesn't have a mic. So what are some tricks for making it easy for everybody to communicate from you at the computer to every member of the band?
My top tip is to try and get rid of headphones if at all possible. And then the way I communicate with the band, out of preference, is by walking in and talking to the band. That's by far the best solution, is not to bother with any electronic means of doing that. If you can do it without that, that's always going to get you the best relationship with the band and the best communication between them. If you can't immediately walk into the live room the whole time, it's a bit difficult, then use a talkback speaker. I often do that. You can hear them through the microphones. They can hear you through the talkback speaker. You can immediately communicate that way. That's
Make
pretty
sure that
easy.
your talkback speaker doesn't have a feedback loop from control room to microphone back through speakers back to,
But usually you'd have to usually put it pretty loud for that to happen.
Okay,
if you've got a little dynamic mic in the control room and you put it through to a tiny little powered speaker or something, it's unlikely it's going to feed back at any reasonable level.
Now, the other thing about recording that way is you're probably not going to be telling the band, okay, we're rolling. Okay, let's do another one. Those are situations where you may want to have your DAW set up to just always be in record, right? So you're just like recording for a long stretch. So anytime they start a song, you've captured it right from the beginning of the song to the end, and you've got that take.
Yes, although what you'll often find with amateur bands is that they appreciate, again, there's this intimidation thing. They don't know how a recording session runs. They have a little bit of an idea. They've seen pictures of recording studios, and they have an idea from Saturday Night Live what a recording session looks like.
Saturday Night
Live. And so they're expecting you to come in and say more cowbell,
Right.
But they don't actually know what the real mechanics of a day in the recording studio looks like. So they really appreciate it when you provide them with a bit of structure. If you go in and go, okay, or when you're speaking to them, you go, okay, it's going to take me a couple of hours to set things up. I'm going to get the drummer to come in first, set out the drums, then we'll get the guitars in, and then, we'll maybe have a snack and then come in before lunch and do a couple of takes of a couple of songs to see how it's going. Then we'll come back and start doing proper takes in the afternoon. Immediately, that gives them a structure, an idea of when they're going to need to perform, when they're going to need to be on the ball, how they're going to need to pace themselves. And then when they're doing takes, you can say, okay, what we'll do is we'll do 2 or 3 full takes. We'll come back and listen to them and decide whether we're getting the right kind of stuff. If we need to do any little sections if I think there are some things where there's a bit of timing or whatever, or I think we might be able to get a better performance for this bit of it, then we'll come in and do that. And then what I'll do is I'll create our final take by chopping together sections of that take. Now, that means I'm going to need to make sure that you look at a metronome before you start playing, so you're doing roughly the same speed for each take. We're going to need to make sure you're in tune between takes. Just that little bit of structure makes it feel like a natural extension then of their rehearsal process. Mm-hmm. They'd get together, they'd play music together, and then you're just providing that little bit of structure and showing them how their rehearsal room experience extends then into making a record. And, again, another great way of making that recording experience seem non-intimidating is starting from the way they set up and the way they record in the rehearsal room. This is one of the reasons I love recording on location, is that you can go where the band feel comfortable, not bring them into this weird spaceship place called a studio where they are afraid of breaking things and they feel intimidated because they feel like they know nothing and that everything's more expensive than they are. You go to their house or their local school hall or whatever, and they're kind of in control. You're in their space. It's not intimidating because, if anything, you should be the one being intimidated because you're coming into this place you know nothing about. So
you probably are intimidated.
Well, yeah.
All right. So I got a couple more topics that we should hit as we're rolling out here. Let's talk about this one. So you're recording the band. They've got their guitar amps going. It sounds pretty good, but maybe on playback, it's like, we could have dialed that in a little better. Do you have some thoughts in the book about reamping guitars and that sort of thing, and like adding more amps to a guitar sound? Do you have any tips?
Absolutely. I mean, in a sense, one of the kind of Project Studio recording hacks that is worth using, and this is particularly obviously with bass, because there are inherent problems of recording bass in Project Studio environments, but also with guitars. It doesn't really cost you anything to stick a DI between the guitar and the pedal board and the guitar and the amp. And then the bass and the amp. And it just provides you with a little bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card, just in case you misjudge something. I mean, I'm always a little bit cagey about things like that because you could start using it as a crutch. A lot of things that are fail-safes, if you lean on them too hard, you're not going to work hard enough when you're actually recording. So I do try to do whatever I can to make sure that the sound is as close to the sound we want on the session, but having some fail-safe, particularly because, as we've already discussed earlier on, you don't know exactly what you're hearing. You might be hearing something a bit dodgy because of you're on location. So having a few fail-safes makes some sense, and DIs and reamping, of course, those are really useful things to be able to do.
Right. So basically you would take the guitar and you would run it, like we're used to a DI for a bass. A bass goes into the DI, then it goes on its way to the amp. And I think the first place we're introduced to that is on the stage. It's like the sound guy wants a DI of the bass. But it works great in the studio too. Although sometimes you look at it and you're like, now we have to learn about phase aligning the bass DI to the bass amp that is mic'd, which should apply as well to a guitar signal, is making sure that those are phase aligned, or time aligned rather, because the sound of the guitar going into a DI is going to get recorded slightly quicker than the sound of that guitar continuing through pedals, going through the amp processing, then playing through the air, and then getting captured into a mic. But what that DI guitar can do is it can give us that luxury to try a virtual guitar amp later. We could even rerun that guitar out to the same guitar chain later, and just, on a different day or in the same amp in a different location where we're like, oh, now we can get a great sound. Maybe you come back to the studio with that same guitar amp and you re-record it, and now you've got your favorite mic and your favorite mic pre, and you've got a great room mic you can use or something. So those are all reasons why you could do it. I guess another way
I would give some other reasons too.
Yeah.
And it's because I think I agree with everything you've said, but it's a really difficult slippery slope, because if you give musicians any excuse to be indecisive about stuff, they often will be. And also there's a bit of a flip side of that as well, that if you take a DI of a guitarist's guitar, there are some guitarists who'll be quite worried that you're going to mess with the sound that they've got from their amp after the fact.
Right.
And they get a bit cagey. So whenever I record DIs, I almost always say, look, this is a kind of a backup thing in case anything goes wrong or in case there's some kind of spill problem. I mean, that's the real advantage of DIs for me, is that if you get some hideous spill on the guitar amp, after the fact, you could use the DI to reamp through exactly that same channel and get it without spill if you needed it.
So what would spill
that's
be?
definitely
What do
the
you
case
mean
with
by
bass
spill?
too.
When
Well,
you
let's say you're recording a whole band in a room, and you get some hideous hi-hat spill on the guitar amp.
I don't know if I've ever had that. So, boy, you got somebody really kicking that hi-hat.
Yeah, well, we're talking amateur musicians here.
Yeah.
I mean, admittedly, you get it more with acoustic instruments, but yes, and or on the bass amp would be a definite thing you could get that on. And so, if you want to try and EQ something, all of a sudden you've got to engage with the fact that there's nasty hi-hat spill on there. And so, the moment you've got that, okay, well, if you've got the DI, you can actually pump that DI through exactly the same rig you just recorded, record it in sync with the whole thing, and you've got a spill-less version of that guitar sound if you want it.
Right. Love it. All right. Well, so I was going to say the other thing that could be really interesting is you could run the DI into like a virtual guitar amp with crazy ambient effects on it later. So it might be a great way to add an effect that is really unique to the guitar signal and keep the original guitar amp and still have that be your main thing. So
I mean, there are plenty of engineers who have recorded multiple amps at once in big studio complexes so that they, from a single guitar performance, they can create dynamics in the mix by bringing in different guitar amps. Exactly. But you can keep the original guitar that they've recorded, but then when it gets to the chorus, you can add a bit more of some high gain amp alongside it that mixes in with it and gives you dynamics that weren't there in the original arrangement.
Well, what's funny is I remember doing that in the studio with the band, but we didn't have the foresight to record the guitar through a DI. I was just taking the guitar recording that was coming out of the amp and reamping that to another amp.
Right.
And even as bad as that sounds like it should be, it still worked and it still helped us level up the chorus and stuff like that by adding more guitar sounds. All right, so there was another thing that was listed in the book that was very cool. A couple more things I want to bring up. This one was called the back of the hand trick.
Yes.
You remember that? Tell us what that's all about.
Now, this is one that I originally read about from a mix engineer called Mike Stavrou. And originally, I mean, Mike Stavrou, if you've ever read his book, it's called Mixing with Your Mind. It is full of some of the craziest ideas, cool, crazy ideas. But he's such a left field guy in the way he thinks about stuff. There's lots of really thought-provoking stuff in there. And originally I thought, well, is this just a bit of a weird thing? And what he found was that when he was positioning his tom microphones on a drum kit, that he could judge where to put his tom microphones by putting his hand over the microphone, and as he moved it around, feeling the hairs on the back of his hand vibrating in sympathy with the sound of the drum, and that when they vibrated in a certain way, he felt that was the right place for the tom microphone to be. And I'd thought, no, come off it. I'm not sure I believe this. I tried it myself a couple of times and thought, I'm not sure I'm getting this. But then I went to British Grove Studios, which is Mark Knopfler's studios, and I was speaking to Chuck Ainley, and he said exactly the same thing in positioning a microphone in the kick drum. And I have a feeling he might have said he learned it from Ed Cherney, who's like another big name engineer. So I was like, okay, so this is a secret that it isn't just Mike Stavrou, there's a load of other people.
Wow, so you could try that on a kick drum. I love that concept.
I mean, kick drum, it kind of makes a bit more sense to me because the vibrations and the actual acoustic power and the amount of air being moved is bigger, so you'd feel it a bit more. Maybe Mike Stavrou just has these, we talk about golden ears. Maybe he has the golden hand hairs.
Well, I'm wondering if anybody was like actually a hobbit, and they just had like seriously golden hand hairs. I don't know.
Audiophile feet.
Yeah, exactly. This podcast is proud to present Recording Studio Rockstars Academy. Are you ready to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level and make your best record ever? Then visit the Academy to find the course that's right for you. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Then check out Rockstars of Drums to learn how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a professional Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Or if you're ready to start mastering your own records at home, then check out Rockstars of Mastering, where I walk you through exactly how I master my own records using nothing but plugins. Plus, I take you into a world-class mastering studio, Sterling Sound, to meet with Ryan Smith and hear how he professionally mastered my record, Skadoosh, for release to streaming platforms. That's the music you hear on this podcast, Rockstars. And if mixing is your focus, then check out my free mixing course, Mix Master Bundle, where I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins in Pro Tools. Plus, you get a look at how I recorded everything in my studio and multi-track downloads for you to practice mixing and even upload to your website if you want. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy to get started now. Okay, so then that brings to mind another picture in the book that I think was a picture of a kick drum with a whole bunch of D112 mics in it. And it
Yes.
mentioned that you have a library of mic positions. So that's kind of a cool, fun thing because we hear about positions of mics on guitar amps, drums, different instruments. But a lot of times we might think, it'd be great to know, but right now I've got to just hurry up and get this thing ready. And we don't know. We don't get a chance to discover it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally with any instrument and any type of mic that you're using, there are so many possible mic positions you could put the mic in, and there's a limit to how much time you have on a typical session. I mean, like I say, all the stuff I write about is typical Project Studio stuff where you never have enough time. So it really helps if when you're going in to record an instrument that you've maybe not recorded that often before, if you can just eliminate a bunch of mic positions that aren't going to be useful and have a short list of ones that are more likely to be useful so you make the best use of your session time. And so I set up this resource a while back where I recorded a whole bunch of different instruments in a very specific way to allow you to compare mic positions independent of the performance. So it's the same performance you're hearing through the different mic positions and also independent of the mic type. So it's the same model of mic in multiple versions in different positions around the instrument. And so I've done that with kick drums, snare drums, cymbals, acoustic guitar, electric guitar, upright and grand piano, all the saxes, flute, upright bass, all these. So you might have upright bass with like 6 different mics around it, or piano with like 5 different mic pairs in different positions around it in different different distances. And so it means that then you can go look at the pictures that are in the, it's a web resource, it's a website. It has all the pictures labeled where the microphones were. And then you've got little buttons. You can play the different microphones and hear what they sound like. And in some cases, you can listen to the left and right channel separately or listen to them together as a stereo pair. And basically just get an idea of like the kinds of sounds that you like and where those are most likely to be found. I mean, obviously your mics will be different, your instruments will be different, but you'll get yourself into the right ballpark quicker doing things that way.
No, that's very cool because I remember going through piano micing questions, and it's a lot easier to start at a website where there's some different versions of mic in the same piano and go like, oh, that's the kind of sound I'm looking for, than it is to go out to the control room, try doing some stuff, get somebody to play it, move it to a new place.
The piano examples are some of the most extensive. Yeah. I mean, there've got to be 100 audio examples there of different microphone positions.
Well, it's
same with the acoustic
guitars. One to do. And the other thing I'll add is when you do try and move everything yourself to arrive at a decision, inevitably you're going to go through the thing where you try 4 different things and you decide you like the first one best, but you can never quite get it back to where it was the first time you did it.
Yeah.
So a lot better to decide ahead of time at through a resource like what Mike has set up for you, Rockstars, and then just set it up one time for yourself and be like, nailed it. Okay, Mike, I know we're extending our time here. Have you got time for one more question and then we'll close out on our closing?
I definitely have time for one more question.
Okay, great. So you had
do you have time for one more answer then?
we'll see. Yeah. Well, there's so much cool stuff in your book. So Rockstars, I want to encourage you to check that out. But this one leapt out at me too. This was a trick for phase aligning mics by not by wearing your musician out, but by setting it up ahead of time and just using a jam box and a radio, and then just sort of checking the phase relationship on the mics before you. I should preface this. This is if you're going to use a pair of mics that are recording something, particularly if they're like side by side kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then there was a cool
trick
where
you've got those kind of like phase aligned multi-miking. You'll often see this on like guitar amps, particularly.
Yeah. So
two mics next to each other. Well, I mean, fundamentally, if you have two microphones picking up the same signal and they're slightly different distances from the instrument, you're going to get a delay between the two signals then when they get mixed together. And that delay is going to cause this weird kind of frequency effect called comb filtering. And the closer you can get those microphones to being exactly the same distance from the source that you're recording, the less that effect is going to impact on the sound. And the very small differences can make actually a surprisingly big difference, particularly if you're close miking a guitar cab with two microphones right side by side. So if you get, before the session, if you work out what the alignment of those microphones needs to be exactly as close as you possibly can in phase with each other, it means then when you put those up in front of your guitar amp, you can make sure they're in that physical alignment that you worked out before, and you won't get this comb filtering effect, and you'll get a much fuller sound when you combine those two mics together. And like you say, the way I would do it is just get a little radio or whatever you use, put one of the mics up in front of it, put the second mic next to it, but invert its polarity on your mixing desk. Right. And then try and combine them to get the weakest possible signal. In other words, the maximum cancellation between them. Then when you take the polarity inversion out, then you should get the strongest possible signal, the least comb filtered and the most phase matched. And it's easier to hear the phase match when you're looking for the weakest possible signal with one of them inverted than it is to hear the best phase match when they're both in the correct polarity. Yeah. So it's just a kind of a hack for zooming your ears in on exactly what the phase match needs to be.
And then I think the final hack that was really cool was you already put white console tape around the body of each mic, and then so that once you had them lined up, you carefully took a Sharpie and drew a little line across them, or little arrows that met in the middle, so that you could, if you needed to reset these mics up next to each other at any point, you could always just line up the two arrows and you know that this pair of mics are in phase with each other.
Yeah. And in fact, as well, once you've done that, you just take a picture of it. And then if the tape comes off, you can still pretty much eyeball where they need to be.
Right on.
I mean, the difference of a half a centimeter can be the difference of a good deal of comb filtering up at the top of the frequency spectrum.
Yeah.
So as long as you're within about a half a centimeter of where you need to be, you should avoid the worst of the comb filtering effects.
Rockstars, what, part of the question is, well, why do you want to set up two mics next to each other? Well, a good example would be that you have two mics that have different characteristics. So maybe you have a dynamic SM57 that's right next to a Shure SM81, which is a condenser mic, which have very different qualities. And by recording both of them on the same guitar amp or other instrument, acoustic guitar could be a great example for that too, you now have the ability to blend more or less of each level. And it's like adding different EQ curves onto the sound of what you're doing. And so you can get a very cool, unique sound that you couldn't get from just one mic.
That technique is used by so many different people, and every producer seems to have their own preferences. I mean, like I say, I do lots of research in different producers, and one of the things I did was look up all their preferences of which mics they use for guitar. And there's a load of examples in the book of, where someone uses an MD421 and a U87, and another person uses a U87 and a ribbon mic. And, there are lots of different principles the different engineers have and the way they combine things. Yeah.
So what do you say to the rock stars as far as, do they need to stress out about picking the exact right mics to start out with in their studio? Or is it simpler than that? Can we start with affordable stuff that's accessible to us and still apply all these techniques, and it just helps us learn how to use them better?
You can definitely use affordable stuff. You do need to bear in mind, though, that affordable mics are affordable for a reason. And the big thing that, the two big things I would say that are the difficulty with affordable mics is that you tend to have to be more careful where you position them. If you see people in the studio with incredible mics, they won't have to position them nearly as well as you will if you're using more budget mics. If you're using budget mics, I would say 80% of the first mic positions you put up, you're going to have to move. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that when you start recording ensembles, what you'll find is that the spill of other instruments that comes into cheap mics tends to sound a lot worse than when you're using expensive mics. And so it makes ensemble recording just harder work. It's not impossible, but you have to put the work in and properly move things around and think about it a bit more.
Right, and that's
expensive mics are very forgiving.
That's otherwise known as off-axis rejection on microphones. So things that the mic are trying to reject on the cheaper mics, they tend to do a sloppier job of it, and so
and they get kind of hideous tonal colorations and stuff.
Right,
the spill just sounds unnatural. Whereas on expensive mics, the spill tends to sound much more natural.
Right, fascinating. All right, well,
I wouldn't worry about that. I just get on with using the mics that you are, and just get used to working hard with them. Actually moving them around.
Well, I was thinking about that double mic technique, and it's like Rockstars, you're likely to have an SM57, and you're likely to have a small diaphragm mic or a large diaphragm one, and so you could just pair those two up and discover
plenty of really great records have been recorded with mics like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me go to our closing question here, Mike. This one is hypothetical. You've answered it before, but we'll ask you again. We're going to take the Wayback Studio machine, and you get to go back in time and find younger Mike and say, "Listen, Mike, you're Mike Senior now, but you used to be Mike Junior, and so I'm coming back to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself." What advice do you feel like going back and giving yourself today, if you could?
Oh, good question. I suppose I should think of a related one to stay on topic.
It could be. Or maybe it's about putting a book together with all this cool stuff in it. I don't know.
I suppose so. Okay, I'll tell you the thing that I wish I had known maybe 10 years earlier than I knew it. And this is a little story. I was at the Audio Engineering Society. This must be even 5 or 6 years ago. And Al Schmidt, the celebrated recording engineer, was there on the Grammy recording panel, and there were various other really famous engineers there, and a question came in for the audience, which was, what's your favorite EQ? And the guy, I think it was Frank Filippetti, who was chairing the panel, he said, "Oh, well, Al, you're the real kind of recorder, you're the elder statesman here. You should answer this first." And Al Schmidt was like, "Well, I'm really sorry." He was quite apologetic about it. "I'm really sorry, but I don't use EQ." And this was like a 1,000-seater hall, and you could hear a pin drop. You could hear gasps. And Frank Filippetti said, "Oh, what? You mean when you're recording?" He goes, No, I don't use any EQ at all."
Wow.
And this is a guy who's won more Grammys for engineering than anyone else in the world. And I wish I had just known that it was possible to make these incredible sounding records just from microphones and a bit of reverb, And
knowing what you're hearing, hopefully that helps.
Just acknowledging that it is possible to make such incredible sounding records just by knowing something about instruments and microphones and musicians, and nothing past the microphone matters then in that sense. If he could do that work in that way, it's a kind of line in the sand. It's a challenge that would have made me not fuss about so many other things, because I'd go, well, clearly it doesn't really matter if you can do such great work just with microphones and musicians in rooms.
That's awesome. Well, that frees us up to go into our studio and go make some records. So just grab some mics, set them up right, Rockstars, and get to it. Make some great records. Mike, where should the Rockstars go find out more about you? Where would you like them to go? I mean, we're going to include a link, I think, in the show notes.
I think that's the easiest thing. And I mean, because we've mentioned all sorts of stuff that I do in this conversation. So if you just go to cambridge-mt.com/rockstars, all one word, I'll have a page there and I'll put links to all this stuff in there. It's the easiest way. I have such mountains of stuff. I've been doing this for so many years now that it accumulates. So I forget about some of it.
I love it, dude. Well, thank you so much for hanging with us again. It's great to see you again. And next time, hopefully, maybe I'll see you back at AES again, or see you in Nashville when you come visit. And Rockstars, thank you for listening. Mike, you rock, dude.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure as always.
All right, dude. We'll see you around the studio, man. Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our awesome sponsors who help make this episode possible. Lewitt, Grace Design, Adam Audio, Native Instruments, and Isotope. And remember, at isotope.com and nativeinstruments.com, use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off any plug-in purchase. If you enjoyed Recording Studio Rockstars, please check out our sponsors using the links in our show notes, because it's a great way to help support the show. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're gonna help you make your best record ever. I would also like to thank our fantastic team here at Recording Studio Rockstars, Vlad Weselchenko, Braden Stremming, and Liz Hulitskaya. Thanks so much for listening, Rockstars, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.